Hello and welcome to NARC Live on Wednesday the 1st of October 2025, coming to you live from Norfolk on the east coast of England with Tammy M0TC.
Hello.
And me, David G0UPL. Lovely to see you. On tonight's show, Hans G0UPL joins us live from Turkey to talk about the latest developments from QRP Labs. We look back at the crazy zany fox hunt last Sunday and we find out what on earth this is. And we only had 3 entries this week. But if you know what that is and you didn't enter and you know what that is for or what it's for, I'll tell you why I'm smiling in a minute, then do pop it onto BATC or Facebook. And by the way, BATC is working fine this time. The message, you can ask comments and make ask questions and everything else on BATC as you always did. Right, Tammy, explain.
You need to put your microphone on because although you told me to switch your microphone, you hadn't actually put it on. So
that's true.
Just intermission for a minute.
Sorry about that.
That's why you can't hear Dave very well.
I couldn't think why. Tammy was. Do you want to just reconstruct?
I was just doing this while you was
all
talking.
the time I was reading my script. I was wondering what that was all about.
Microphone on.
Right. Okay. Excuse me. Do you have a little musical omission? Yeah, one of those things. Years ago, they used to play the Potter's Wheel if something went wrong. The first time I've ever done that, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
Don't
Can
do
you
it
hear
again.
me? Right. You hear me now?
That's better.
Testing. All right. Let's start anyway. So we start with club news, and you'll remember probably that last weekend was our final direction-finding fox hunt of the year. And we call this the crazy, zany fox hunt because the foxes are allowed to change the rules slightly and mix it up a bit. But before I tell you how they did that, we can have a look at a video montage of some of the pictures of them setting up, just to tell you that we start off at Thorpe Recreation Ground at 10 o'clock, or just before 10 o'clock on Sunday, when the foxes start transmitting. Here we go. Now you'll notice here, I'm going to talk over this a little bit, this wonderful music that Tammy's put on here, because you can see that everybody's set up there and we're opposite a football ground, and what probably from these shots aren't quite so good, but there are football teams, this is early just before they started, but there are football teams getting ready. You see that there? You can see that footballer starting to play around and people playing football around us starting to wonder what the heck we're doing, and I had a lot of people looking over, like that guy there, thinking what on earth are they doing? And they were setting those things out on the ground to start practicing with and everything. I heard somebody say maybe it's something to do with VAR, but I don't know. Anyway, that's really true. But you can see the footballers doing this. Bob looks like he's going to zap them, I think, there. But it was quite fun. And it is like this every Sunday morning there. They've got more than one pitch on Thorpe Recreation Ground. And maybe, just maybe, the Foxes use that to their advantage, as you'll find out in a little while. See, this team, they just sit in the car and use the stuff, whereas this team use it the traditional way, get their maps out, take bearings and everything. The transmissions were on 145-300. There's David and Ben there. This is Team Tornado. And there we are. And that's the pictures of what happened from 10 o'clock on Sunday, which is incidentally when the footballers started playing as well. So very, very funny to do that. But now, as I said to you at the beginning, this zany fun one often has a bit of something a bit different. There's some twists to it, and they're allowed to do this because it is just for fun. So the start point was at Thorpe Recreation Ground. So Tammy, can we have a look at the map please, just to show where that is in Norwich? You're probably aware of Norwich, Thorpe Recreation Ground probably. That's Laundry Lane there at the top, you can see that, that's just off here. And you can see in there all of those different pitches there. There are lots of different pitches, it shows you how big this is. That's a full size football pitch, that one. So that is a very, very big ground. And they were parked around there, just above that yellow arrow. People were parked there with their cars, and then they were taking bearings and everything from there. Now the twist comes now when we show you where the fox was. Look at the top left. For the first time ever, the foxes were, well, I can't accurately measure it. I think it was something like 180 metres away. And this was the fox's idea. And we thought it would floor people. We met actually last Thursday to do a technical rehearsal. I went there and said, can we, are we going to get away with this? Because normally you saw people out with their handheld direction finding gear, and it would only have taken a little walk along there and gone to the end, and they would have found them. But of course, with direction finding, you only take bearings, and normally you do it with a method called triangulation. So you need to take more than one bearing, because you need to get an idea of where they are and the location of them, not just the bearing. You need several bearings, in other words, to find out where it is by triangulation. And because it was a Sunday, and because there were literally hundreds of people, those car parks were full, and there were footballers all over the match, we figured that people wouldn't make a venture further along the pitch as they normally would on a normal fox hunt during the summer. And it kind of worked, I think, because the teams set off. By the way, we've got a picture of the fox here. We could show you this. This was the fox. They were in the car park on the top left there. It's in Paul's car, because not many people would have recognised Paul's car probably. And you can see, it's got a magnet on the top. Although I can reveal here that actually the signal was too strong, even with 2 attenuators and the lowest setting on the radio. So what they did for the initial first transmission is they put the aerial in the boot of the car to give it enough attenuation so that there was just enough signal for people to take bearings. And everybody set off in their cars, and then they could put the mag mount back on the roof and carry on with transmissions. So how do you think people did? I think this is the fun bit, really. Well, we could show you the winning team actually found it. Remember, it's 180 metres away approximately. They found it in 5.6 miles. And here they are. And at least one of them used a rather rude word when they found it, because they had to go off into Thorpe. If you know the Sainsbury's in Thorpe at Pound Lane, they went there, they took a reading, and they said, well, it's behind us. And they went backwards and forwards. So that was that's Team Tornado. And in fact, they gave us this picture, which Tammy's going to explain what that means.
Well, it's hear no evil, speak no evil, and see no evil.
Well, they said radio, so hear no radio, speak no radio,
see no radio.
Okay. Yep. Well done to them. They found it in 5.6 miles, and the only other team out of 5 to find it at all properly was Team Bitten DX. I don't think we've actually got a picture of them arriving, unfortunately. And they found it in 12.5 miles. So they used 12.5 miles worth of fuel and quite a long time, I believe, about an hour or something like that to find it. It's quite funny, isn't it, really? Mm. When I talked to them afterwards, they said, in fact, we can just show you a picture of our lunch that we had afterwards. So most people went along to the racecourse, Castle Carvery, for lunch just afterwards. And some of them, well, most of them found it fun, I think. Unfortunately, the foxes couldn't make the lunch, so they're not there. But most of the other people who were taking part were there, apart from Bitten. And we all had a nice carvery lunch there. But they really... They found it quite clever and also incredibly devious. But of course, there was no rules to say that it couldn't be such an incredibly close distance. I know I also put a mention in for Team Meandering, because they went back to the Thorpe Recreation Ground. They realised that they probably were going back to where they started, but they didn't actually manage to find the fox, who was on the other car park just at the other end of the football pitch. But good on everybody. Good on Team Wrong Direction and Team Bob +2 as well, who all took part. And a special congratulations to the Fox Destruction crew for their final hunt of the season. As winners of last year's hunt. I think they did really well. Very, very devious. And I don't think that can be tried again for too long, for at least for a while anyway. So that's what happened on Sunday. Now, over the last few weeks, we've announced our sad losses of 2 friends and members of our club. And we have now got details of the funeral. I don't I don't intend to go through the absolute details here, but just to mention the dates really. Dave G4ZST, of course, who is chair of the Lowestoft Radio Club as well, his funeral is on the 7th of October at 12 o'clock in Beccles. Full details on our website and also in the newsletters, but you can find it live on our website at the moment. And also Chris G4ILR, his funeral is on Tuesday the 14th of October, so exactly a week later, and his is in Dunstable on that date at 2 p.m. But the full details and everything, the addresses of where everything is, are on our websites. Now back to our club and to events happening. Now next Wednesday is the tabletop sale, and there's lots of interest in this tabletop sale. I don't know why. Maybe you've all collected lots of stuff you want to sell, or maybe it's because you're keen to go to, it's a long time since our Barford Radio Rally and you're keen to go to another rally. So many people, in fact, that I've changed the room to a much larger room, and we're now going to meet at the dining hall or canteen, which is next door to the room we normally meet. So as you look at the back of the school where you go in, the door you normally go there, don't go in that door, go to the door just to the right. I'll try and put a sign up as well. There'll be lots of people, I'm sure, anyway. It's 50% bigger, the room next door, lots more tables as well. So there will be room for everybody to have a decent amount of selling space and people to move around. I was able to change this with the school, my booking that I made earlier in the year. So that's the details. Now, because of that, there is a Keep Fit club that uses that room until 7 p.m. and they obviously need time to pack everything up, and we need time to set the tables up. So because of this, we won't allow anybody in to set up or anything for trading until 7:15. We just need that extra 15 minutes. But don't worry, we won't be finishing until 9:30, so it's a good 2.25 hours. So that's plenty of time for tabletop sale. So just make a note of that though. Please don't arrive before 7:15. At least don't arrive to set up, because we must let the previous let out, and we must organise the room. It is for members only. It's free of charge if you're a member. If you're not a member and you want to join, unless you've been before, you will have to pay £5 to join the club for the rest of the year. That's just to be fair to everybody else who does pay their subs, which are at the lowest they've ever been, really, or at least for very, very many years, just because there are so many members, which we're very pleased about. But to be fair to those people who do pay, we won't allow guests unless you've never been to the club before and you're just coming to see what it's like. And that's fine. Maybe you'd like to wear your badges and shirts if you've got them as well. Okay, so that's the tabletop sale next Wednesday between 7:15 and 9:30. The following Wednesday, we're back here for NARC Live. A couple of other things just to tell you about. The RSGB convention is on the 10th to the 12th of October, and this Sunday, October the 5th, is your last chance to buy advance tickets, either to the days or the dinner. And the rates are £41 in advance for the Saturday, £37 for the Sunday, or £51 for both days. So it's not very much extra to go for both days if you can. We also have a dinner table at the dinner, a NARC table with lots of club members who go to it. If you would like to be part of that table, we'd like us to reserve your space, then contact Andy M0NKR, or you can email me and I'll forward your message on. The details for the convention are at rsgb.org/convention. It's a great weekend, over 50 talks as well, and presentations and workshops. One other date to tell you, actually we've got a slide, haven't we, Tammy? Did we put that up? Didn't mention that, sorry. One other thing you'll see there, and I know it's horrible to mention that C word right now, but it is the 1st of October, and I have booked the Village Inn at Little Melton for our Christmas dinner on Wednesday the 17th of December. Managed to get it on a Wednesday. That's just a week before Christmas, isn't it? So there we are. Put that in your diary now. I'll be issuing booking forms with menus and choices and things like that a bit nearer the time, but you can put that in your diary now. It is booked. That's it for club news. We've got one bit of members news we'd like to share with you as well. This is from Paul, G0UPL, who went on for a few days break on the Isle of Wight, and he went on a proper steam train. He says that Elizabeth doesn't get out much. Some of you will know what that in-joke means. His wife's name's really Linda, you know.
Yeah,
but anyway,
I know.
Yeah,
I know.
anyway. But they went on this. The weather was warm and dry for the holiday, and he says also that the coach was using all the original coaches with none corridors seating. It took him back to his childhood. There we are. Well, I mean, the railway is 200 years old this week, so I'm not sure if Paul quite remembers that first run. But anyway, thanks very much for that, Paul. Now, Tammy, over to you for Little People.
Yep, here's Little People this week. Do you know what happened to all the old telephones?
You
know,
skip
the
somewhere? Oh yeah, the dial ones. No, not really.
And their accessories. Well, this is what's happened to them. Been turned into bike racks.
Oh yes. Oh, I like it. That's what the curly cords saw.
Yeah.
Do you know, I bet there's some youngsters now, they don't even know what that is. Would they need to know how to use it? Would they actually know how to dial a number? There's a test for you.
They did. I have seen a video on somewhere a while ago where they gave some children one of those phones to see if they could work out how to use it. Yeah.
And could they?
It was quite hilarious.
I can imagine. Our little Finn, our 5-year-old nephew, I'm not sure, would he better use it?
No.
He wouldn't know. He'd think it's a game, wouldn't he?
No idea, would they?
Anyway. We must be getting old.
You must.
There we are. Miniature-calendar.com. They put a new picture up every year. Lovely Japanese website that is that create those pictures, and Chami chooses one for us every week. So do keep in touch with what you're doing. We'll meet again here in 2 weeks' time. So we love to see your pictures and your stories and everything else, and we'd be happy to read them. Just drop us a line to this address, radio@dcpmicro.com, by 3 o'clock on the afternoon of NARC Live in 2 weeks' time. Now to that competition, and the competition the week before, or last week actually, when we were here last, it had loads and loads of entries, but for this we only had 3.
We've actually got one.
Oh, have we got one on here?
Yeah,
so let's just show the picture anyway, Tammy, if we could, please.
So what on earth is this?
Oh, and I've just seen, by the way, just before I mention that, I've just seen a comment from Sonny. He says, I cannot repeat the words that were used. I can confirm that had nothing to do with me, as in Sonny. Blame Mark G0TMT. That was for the idea of where the fox hunt was going to go. Yeah. So it was going to be just 180 metres away. And what was the question? Who's put a comment?
Colin M0GMK thinks it might be a spark plug cover.
Oh, yeah. Okay. See where you are that go in there. Bruce G4KZT says, I think this is a tent pole foot to prevent the pole pushing through the ground sheet.
Tom G8XQD looks very much like a foot from your NARC Live video background display this week.
God, that's really having to think about that. And Bob G6PWS says, first, I think this is a hub protector for a bike. 2, is it a foot for a camping tent pole? Or 3rd, is it a hubcap? Or 4th, it's a sprocket for a sewing machine to stop it going too fast. Sewing machine.
Is Bob allowed 4 guesses?
Well, not really, but I think they're desperate because the week before we must have had 20 entries to this competition.
We did.
So anyway, Tammy, let's put everybody out of their misery and explain what it's for. Well, it's a bit naughty, really.
It is. It's actually a bike protection packaging.
Yes.
Now, I wouldn't have guessed it, but I have seen one before. Because when you get a bike, particularly a child's bike, they normally come in a box, and the nuts that hold the front wheels in usually have those over it, so they don't pierce through the box.
Right. Okay. This may be an apology time from me, because did I not send you this image of it of the actual packaging in use?
No, you didn't.
I'm so sorry about that. To be honest, so this is from Brian M7SEY. Thank you very much, Brian.
If you talk quietly between yourselves.
So you're now going to put this on. We'll put
2
some of that
seconds.
music on again. We had a bit of a rush to get this done, to be honest with you, today. But anyway, we're going to show you a picture of actually how that thing is used. So it's a bit of packaging, and I suppose we could say that Bob got closest with a hub protector for a bike, although he'd have had no idea. And now I've got a fill, haven't I?
Yeah, you have.
Right, while you do this.
I think I might have sent this to one of the other computers.
Okay. Well, we're going to show this picture, if we can, to you of that item in use. There we go. Right, we're just going to show you that, and with the miracles of technology and a video mixer and a computer to put a graphic up, we're going to show you this. And that's what it came from Brian. He sent us that picture. Amazingly, really, I think Bob, we've got to give him that, because it's a hub protector for a bike. Well, it is, but he wouldn't have thought it was from the packaging, would he? And apparently it was when he was putting his granddaughter's bike together that he thought this might make a mystery one. So you really fooled everybody there, Brian. Now we're going on to the next one. This is the next competition before we meet tonight's guests. And this is an interesting one, and I'm not allowed to give you any clues. Tammy's smiling. Please enter this. What on earth is this? Or what on earth is this for?
Am I allowed to tell the story behind this picture?
Well, you can if you like, but you want to tell me off for giving any kind of clue.
I'm not going to give any clues, but basically, when this picture came in, we were sitting in a restaurant.
We were.
And because you always look at your phone when we're in a restaurant
well,
together,
we both do. We're wonderful, yeah. Typical married couple.
And you started laughing, and you said to me, if you can tell me what this is for,
oh, that's right,
I'll buy tea.
Yeah.
And you showed it to me, and I knew exactly what it's for, and you had to buy tea.
I did. That cost me 40 quid or something.
60?
60 was it? Was it 60? Oh my goodness me. So there you go. I'm not going to buy anybody else dinner though, if you guess what that is. But if you do know what that is or what it's for, I think we have to say that. Because they might... Anyway, I'm not allowed to say anymore.
No, you're not allowed to say anything.
For goodness sake, let us know. You've got 2 weeks to let us know. radio@dcpmicro.com if you know what that is or what it is for. I didn't know, by the way.
I did.
And Tammy did. That's almost. We're looking forward to meet tonight's guest, of course. Just to let you know what's coming up for this coming week in NARC. On Sunday, we've got the GB2RS News on GB3MB at 7 o'clock. And then next Wednesday, October the 8th, as I mentioned earlier in a lot of detail, it is the tabletop sale. Remember, we're meeting in the room next door to where we normally do, just to the right of that, from 7:15. It's free for members to come and sell or buy or whatever. So we look forward to that. And don't forget to keep in touch with your stories. And also we have this card, which we're always happy to send to anybody you feel will be cheered. Anything for the club or for this programme, send to radio@dcpmicro.com. Now, I'd like to say almost our guest tonight almost needs no introduction, I think, because he's been with us several times over the last few years, but also his products are even more famous, I think, if I may say that, than he is, because his products amongst amateurs now are infamous, I think. And without any more waffle anyway, it's lovely to welcome again to NARC Live, Hans Summers, G0UPL. Hello, Hans.
Thank you, David. Nice to be here again. I'm sitting here chuckling at everything you've just been through.
Can I just ask you? Okay,
sounds great.
Well, hopefully, yeah. Can I just ask you, but for goodness sake, don't reveal it. Do you know what that last object thing is? What was for?
No.
Good.
No,
nor
idea.
do I.
What at all?
And I normally.
But I was just still laughing because you were saying that you were sitting there reading your phone. And it reminded me years ago when we were living in Japan, and my wife and I were sitting on the sofa in the evening before we even had any kids, and we were just both typing away on our phones and things. And she sent me a message, "I need a kiss," and I replied, "XX" on the text message.
Oh, how
it
romantic!
Wasn't what she meant.
No, I'm sure it wasn't. I don't think we really want to know how that ended, but
not very well.
Oh, I love the lovely story.
Not how you think.
We're not quite that bad when we go out. Normally, actually, we wouldn't do that, but I think maybe we sometimes go out for a meal before this, actually, and we haven't today. I haven't eaten yet this evening, and probably it was just preparation for the programme or something like that. That's my excuse anyway. But Hans, it is lovely to see you again. You're obviously the boss, the founder of QRP Labs, where you really do help bring affordable radio to lots and lots of people. But I'm going to leave you to tell us about the latest developments with QRP Labs. And of course, to everybody at home now, if you're watching this live, then you can ask questions and make comments and everything for Hans. And I'm sure we'll get through as many as we can at the end. But now handing over to you, Hans.
Thank you, David. Yes, so basically 2025, I had no new product designs or anything. So pretty much since we last spoke here, which was September 2024, and I told you about the SSB project I was working on to implement SSB into QMX. And so that took in total 9 or 10 months in the end. It was a huge psychological effort to keep going on that all the way to the end. I actually have no idea how I got through to the end. I don't think I've ever worked on a project for that long in the previous corporate life or in my QRP Labs life now. So it was really a tough one to get through. But I finally finished that in time for Dayton Hamvention. In fact, about a month before that. And so that was what I was talking about here just over a year ago, the SSB implementation. So really what I'd like to do today is just update you on how that went and how I finished that all off. Because that has been, although there were no new products in 2025, no new hardware designs, that is almost as good as a new product, really. It became such a big thing. So some of these slides I recycled. I hope you'll forgive me, but perhaps some people are not aware of all of the history, so I just very briefly run through. In 2017, I designed the QCX, this CW transceiver, single band CW transceiver, and that was originally for the RSGB YOTA summer camp in August 2017. And then that sort of evolved in 2020 into two different models, QCX Plus on the right there, and QCX Mini on the left for people who wanted a really small form factor. It's about a ratio of 6:1 in the volume between those two. Then in 2021, I did my first digital transceiver, which was 5-band transceivers, 6-band on some of the versions, and 4 or 5 watts with built-in USB sound card, built-in serial COM for cat control. So it works very, very well in WSJTX for FT8 or JS8 call and so on, and a very low cost, high performance. So those were the sort of earlier transceivers. That migrated in 2023. I called it the marriage of QDX and QCX Mini, which was originally going to be a transceiver which looked like the QCX Mini there on the left, but also had the built-in digital functionality of the QDX, which was on the right. So it was kind of an SDR inside, and on the outside it looked the same as a QCX Mini, and it was going to do CW and digital modes. SSB was really a later addition, and so in much the way it turned out in practice, but even the original concept was just CW and digital. So this is a better picture of the QMX as it came to be, and again you'll see it looks exactly like the QCX Mini there on the left, same size, same depth, everything. And there are 3 different versions of this now, the 80 to 20 meter, 60 to 15 meter version, and 20 to 10 meter version. The most popular one is the mid-band version, which seems to be perfect for all the people who want to go portable with this kind of thing for parks on the air or summits on the air or field day, these types of things. And it's a really full-featured CW transceiver as well as digital. So it has CW decoder, dual VFOs, S-meter, power meter, has built-in SWR meter, and all the test tools built in, which kind of followed on from the tradition of the QCX, which had the test tools built in too. USB interface and sound card comes from QDX, and as I said, it's a QDX inside plus a display and a physical implementation like a QCX Mini. And that was launched in May 2023. As of now, we've sold between this and the QMX Plus, which I'll come on to in a moment, I think just under 13,000 transceivers since May 2023. So they've been a really popular transceiver. Inside, it's very compact and not terribly easy to build. You need to be quite patient with putting it all together. The instructions are very comprehensive, and so as long as you follow them carefully, famous last words, you can get through that quite nicely. It comes on multiple boards which will all come together on one panel. So the first thing you do is break that out into the separate panels shown on the bottom left there. All the SMD components are pre-installed, factory assembled. So what's left for the constructor is the connectors, the toroids, the capacitors, and the transistors, and then all fitting it all together. A year later, I made the QMX Plus, which is like, as the QMX is to the QCX Mini, the QMX Plus is kind of like the bigger brother of the QMX, and it's the same enclosure as the QCX Plus, but a different drilled and printed front and rear panel. And this covers all the bands from 160 meters to 6 meters, and it runs the same firmware as QMX, so it has all of those features, CW and digital, that the QMX has, but it also has a couple of additions. The first one was an internal GPS option, so it's got a SMA connector at the back if you use that option. GPS is useful for displaying the time if you want to use a standalone whisper beacon feature. It also has a battery and a battery backed up real-time clock with an internal CR2032 battery size, which was the most common button cell battery, coin cell battery I could find. And it has a development board option for people who want to make their own modification. There's a lot of space for modification. I'll show you the next picture, which shows inside the case, and at least 2/3 of the internal volume is empty, so there's plenty of space to build your own things, and people have done exactly that. This was launched in 2024 at Dayton Hamvention again. Here's a picture of the inside and the front panel and the rear panel on the right there. And just like the QMX, all the SMD components are pre-assembled, and the only thing for the constructor to do is the through-hole components, the toroids and connectors and capacitors and the front panel assembly. The capacitors, the yellow and blue capacitors you see in this picture, this is actually a revision 1 of the QMX Plus. The current revision is actually even easier to build because the capacitors are now SMD as well as the rest of it. So on the QMX, because there are 3 different versions and they have different values of filter components, the capacitors in the filters have to be through-hole because we can only make 1 set of boards, and then the constructor, depending what components are installed, that determines the band version. Whereas on the QMX Plus, because there's only 1 version that covers 160 meters all the way through to 6 meters, the capacitors are always the same, so they don't need to be changed by the constructor or installed by the constructor. So those are now through-hole. And I don't know if the mouse comes out. If I move my mouse, if you can see it coming around here.
Yeah, I think we can see
that. These are the switching power supplies for the 3.3 volt and 5 volt rail. Because a feature of these transceivers is really low received current consumption, around about 90 milliamps for really long battery life if you want to run them off a battery. So they use these buck converters. And on the current PCB revision, those are actually now part of the main board, so it makes it easier to build. Some people have made their own nice modifications, and this is a US project that includes a auto tuner as well as a battery and a speaker. So it runs very nicely off 3 18650 batteries, standard, very common batteries, as you see there on the top right. This modification is made by 2 boards which are installed on top of each other. Really demonstrates a good use of the space inside the QMX Plus for modifications. And that was just one project. There was also a project by Najati TA7MNA, who lives only about an hour's drive from where I live in the provincial capital of Mulla, the province where I live. He's a university student there. And he designed a similar board, but his is just a battery and speaker board. And so these are really good examples of what kind of things you can do with that space in there. Some of the nice CW features of the QMX, it has a really nice full break-in operation, solid state switching of transmit receive, so there's very little latency, and a very clean envelope shaping. So we use Blackman-Harris envelope shaping, which is even better than the raised cosine envelope shape. And if you look at the bottom right-hand side of this slide contains a comparison at the same size of the spectrum shown. This is from the QST reviews. So these ARL lab measurements of the micro BITX, original QCX, the QMX in the middle, and then the Elecraft KX2 and K3S. And you can just about squint at it, and the QMX almost looks better than the Elecraft KX2, K3S, which of course are radios which you have to add at least another 0 onto the price for. So it's a really nice clean transmitter output, and with very low latency and lots of features like configurable AGC, CW decoder, message memories, frequency memories, and all the iambic key are built in. There are now, I don't know if this was the case last time I spoke to you, but there are now a very configurable set of filters that go from 50 hertz bandwidth up to 500 hertz bandwidth at various center frequencies. So it's a very, very nice CW machine. It's also a very nice digital mode machine, because the method chosen to implement FSK modes, such as Whisper and FT8, is to measure the audio frequency internally in the radio, and then add the audio frequency to the configured USB dial frequency and synthesize that tone directly with an RF synthesizer chip. And the advantage of this over using an SSB transceiver is that it produces a very, very clean signal. And because there's no distortion whatsoever, there's no unwanted sideband, there's no intermodulation products, it's a very, very clean output. And just to relate the little practical experience, it may be completely coincidence, but this afternoon we have had an intern here for the last 2 months in our office here, who's been very, very helpful, and quite possibly is watching this now as I speak. And we decided I wanted to show him how JS8 works, and so we booted up my Raspberry Pi 400 and my QMX Plus and tried sending some CQs on 20 meters, or some heartbeats on 20 meters on JS8 call, and nothing happened. And I suddenly realized I'd left the radio in USB mode, and so I changed it to Digi mode, and immediately we got 3 replies to the heartbeats. So it really appeared that the cleanliness of the transmit signal for FSK modes, this unique measurement of measuring and then adding that and synthesizing it directly, was to a considerable advantage. But that will only work for FSK modes. It doesn't work for phase shift modes or multi-tone modes. Because the radio has a built-in USB sound card and built-in virtual comm serial ports, it's extremely easy to interface with all Digimode software like WSJTX, or in this afternoon's case, JS8 Call. The built-in sound card is 24-bit stereo, 48,000 samples per second, is a very high performance sound card effectively. And this makes it really easy to interface with Digimode software. You have no issues with hum or losses or cables between your PC and your radio, or any disadvantages with interference or RF or anything on these audio cables, because everything is just a single USB cable. So that's a really nice feature. The SSB was the big elephant in the room for quite some time, and I had mentioned at the beginning, when QMX was launched in May 2023, that SSB was going to be on my agenda. And there was even this microphone, which you can see there in the middle of this small PCB, which holds the rotary encoders and buttons, the controls of the QMX. There was a microphone included. And so it was it wasn't exactly a promise, but it was almost a promise. And I think everybody took it as a promise. So I was going to be in trouble if I didn't manage it. And the idea was to follow on from the work on the micro STX and the true STX, which was by Guido PE1 NNZ and Manuel DL2 MAN. And they used a much simpler hardware that was actually based originally on my original QCX transceiver, with a special firmware version for the Atmega 328, which is the Arduino chip. And they used envelope elimination restoration, which is a polar modulation is the other name for it, is a way to generate SSB without using a traditional SSB modulator and linear amplifier. So that was the same aim that I had with QMX, because I had the necessary amplitude modulation with the envelope shaping for the CW, and I could control phase in the same way that Guido had done with the 5351 synthesizer. So I was aiming to follow in his footsteps with this on the QMX, but I never imagined it would be 10 months of very, very hard work to get through to that final outcome. So that's really what the rest of the talk is primarily about, how that all took place and how I managed to get through that. Here's a picture of the true SDX, and as I mentioned, Guido P1NNZ started with the QCX, and Manuel DL2 MAN did a lot of work subsequently on the hardware. There were numerous other people. Barb WB2 CBA is another very famous contributor to the project who made a lot of contributions. As soon as it became popular, there were then quite a few Chinese versions of the transceiver, which Manuel and Guido were quite upset about, because they were being asked to support these transceivers, which in many cases were built with rather poor quality or had defects such as poor spectral purity on the transmitter, not meeting regulations. And so there was some discontent around all of that. I think the reality is that possibly Guido and Manuel were not clear enough from the start about not wanting other people to do anything with the project. So they didn't have any licenses covering it or any attempt to copyright it or anything like that. So I think there was some issues around that. The QMX had a much more powerful hardware implementation compared to microSDX, which is why I dared to launch QMX with that kind of pseudo promise that I was going to deliver SSB, because I knew I had the amplitude modulator, I had the phase modulator, and I had a very much more powerful piece of hardware in terms of the CPU, much faster CPU, 168 megahertz 32-bit ARM Cortex-M4 CPU, and much more flash memory, much more RAM, and more bits of control on the digital to analog converter. So I really thought that I would have a good chance of doing SSB at least as well as it had been done in the microSDX, and hopefully better. In some slides now that I presented in May this year from in Dayton at FDIM about DSP, because it's interesting to understand some of the basics, and it's scary when you start getting into it, but it's really not as bad as it sounds. So the first thing is the oscilloscope on the left, which shows amplitude versus time, and a much less common instrument is a spectrum analyzer. The screenshot is shown there on the right-hand side. And what the spectrum analyzer does is sweep the frequency across what can be quite a narrow range if you want, or a much wider range if you prefer to show transmitter harmonics, and it will show you the spectral amplitude as it sweeps across the frequency. So it's kind of amplitude in decibels versus frequency, and you expect it to be a very high dynamic range instrument, so the vertical axis is typically shown in decibels, not as a linear scale. And so these two different views, it's very important to pay attention in the development of anything like this to both possible ways of looking at it. The key principle in DSP is that you sample everything using an analog to digital converter. And so your perfect sine wave, which is illustrated there on the top left, is sampled at discrete intervals in time, which I've shown as crosses on the sine wave on the top right. And you end up with a series of numbers, which I've shown there on the bottom left, which represent the amplitude at each of those discrete time points. You then do as much mathematics and computation on those to get the desired result that you want, and to do demodulation of the SSB signal from the spectrum received off air. And at the end, you convert it back to analog, which you give to the headphones using a digital to analog converter. And so you pass, in this particular example, I'm just showing the exact same sine wave without any computation. And so pass back into the digital to analog converter, you get this kind of staircase waveform, which you then apply a little bit of filtering to get rid of those corners and get back to a sine wave. So the idea is convert everything to digits, do a bunch of very quick calculations to get the demodulation and filtering and everything else you want, and then convert it back to analog for hearing in your earphones. Now, the calculations themselves are where all the interesting bits come in, and there are many key concepts here. One of the most fundamental is the Nyquist frequency. This was the picture of Nyquist, this dude on the top right there, who was a Swedish-American mathematician. And his most famous contribution is saying that the sample rate should be must be more than twice the signal frequency which is being sampled. So if you want to sample a 1 kilohertz frequency, you should do so at least at a rate of 2 kilohertz. And you can see why that is, because if you imagine in the example I've shown there, if you measure this 1 kilohertz signal, which is the black sine wave, exactly 2 points, you would be able to fit in to the same 2 points a sine wave of twice the frequency, and you would have no way of knowing, when you were trying to reconstruct the waveform at the other end, which of these two sine waves you had started off from, the sine wave with a single cycle or the sine wave with double cycles. But as long as you sample more often than those two blue crosses which I've shown there, more than 2 points per cycle, then you can always guarantee that you can get back to the same cycle that you started with. There isn't that ambiguity of having a double possible frequency. So this is kind of the visual illustration of Nyquist's famous theory. The other very important thing is about dynamic range, and you can, I'm sure, see that if you use a coarse numeric ADC measurement by only measuring at fairly coarse intervals, or if your analog to digital conversion has a limited number of bits, then you will end up with this very rough staircase, and that will give you less dynamic range than you would have if you had a smoother, more precise sampling. And in DSP, this determines the performance of the transceiver in a very, very big way. So for a typical amateur radio transceiver, a kind of rule of thumb is that you should expect to have about 100 dB of dynamic range. Now, what that means is depends on the context and many other things, but it's a good rule of thumb to think about it. And so for that, you would need roughly 16 bits, because each bit is worth 6 dB of dynamic range, and this is the rule: 6 dB per bit. So you would need about 16 2/3 bits to get that 100 dB of dynamic range. So roughly 16 or 17 bits of usable resolution. And there are many, many chips around which claim to be 24-bit and 24-bit sound cards, and all of this sounds very grand. But in practice, the lowest few bits of those are just noise, and so the practical limit is the receiver's noise floor rather than these noisy, least significant bits at the bottom. So you never really get 6 dB per bit. It's a theoretical maximum rather than what you achieve in practice. So a 24-bit analog to digital converter chip doesn't give you 144 dB of dynamic range. I don't believe there's any transceiver available either anywhere, including in the best transceivers in the world in the military, which have that kind of dynamic range. So practically we have a much lower dynamic range. The chip which I use in the QMX is the PCM1804, which has a datasheet specification of 110 dB of spurious-free dynamic range. So it's a very respectable number. The other thing that's very important is filtering, and we have various types of filter, all of which are used in the QMX, and all of them commonly rely on this same principle, that you have a buffer containing a pipeline of samples, and then you shift and add and multiply with some coefficients which are also in a pipeline alongside that. And these coefficients that you keep adding and shifting and multiplying by determine the type of filtering that occurs. So you might want a low-pass filter or a band-pass filter. So for example, if you're making a CW filter, you would want to have a band-pass filter perhaps centered on 700 Hertz with 200 Hertz of bandwidth. And you would choose or design certain coefficients for these filters that would give you that desired result. And various common types of filter are the Fourier transform, which you use to convert a audio signal into frequency buckets or an RF signal. So when you see a pan adapter, if you've got a fancy transceiver with a nice big color TFT display and it shows you a big chunk of the band, that's using a Fourier transform to provide you with a frequency axis across the bottom and amplitude on the vertical axis. Then there's the finite impulse response filter, and the infinite impulse response filter. The finite impulse response filter is what's shown in the diagram there, and is a simpler one to implement, but it also is quite slow to calculate, because there are many calculations for each sample, whereas the infinite impulse response is very convenient and used for audio filtering. A special type of the finite impulse response filter is the Hilbert transform, which also provides a 90-degree phase shift along with an amplitude filter. So that's very, very important for demodulating SSB, as I will explain in a moment. There's a very nice filter designer called Iowa Hills Filter Designer, where you can type in the coefficients you want, and it will give, you type in the bandwidth and center frequency you want and what type of filter, and it will give you all the coefficients to use in your software. So that's a very nice tool I spend a lot of time with. It's long since disappeared off the internet, but you can still find it with the web archive, which remembers everything. And it's also a Windows application, but it still works perfectly fine on Linux if you use the Wine system. So in the QMX, where rather than use a 90-degree phase shift, I actually use a plus 45 and a minus 45. It somehow feels better always to have a symmetric situation, and that feels more symmetric. I'm not sure really whether it makes any difference, but it feels better. There are two types of SDR receivers, and the one which we use in QMX and lower cost, lower power consumption receivers is baseband sampling, which I've put on the right-hand side here. And it has a really good performance and low cost. It's used, for example, the architecture in QMX KX2, Ellercraft KX3, MCHF, and the microSDX, which is to convert everything to baseband I and Q samples, and then you do the processing at this low audio frequency or zero audio frequency direct conversion. And since numerous ADC chips and DAC chips for audio purposes, like CD players or MP3 players or anything which uses audio, are available with very high performance and low cost, this is a really low cost way of doing it. The other option is called direct sampling, and it has the advantage that you can sample a very, very wide RF bandwidth, like 10 megahertz of RF, all at the same time, and you process that with a very much more powerful CPU. It is also much more expensive because the the ADC chips have to have a very much higher bandwidth, sampling at a much faster frequency to be able to sample that whole 10 megahertz chunk of band or more. And examples of transceivers using this are the ICOM 7300 and the Ellercraft K4. So direct sampling is really the most modern way of doing it, but it has disadvantages of cost and also power consumption because of needing the much faster processing. This is a design example, QDX, and QDX I mentioned earlier, and it's simpler than the QMX, which is why I'm showing it here. So the RF comes in and goes through some low-pass filters, transmit receive switch, and so a bandpass filter for the receiver. Bandpass filter is important because even if you have a very high performance mixer, these type of switching mixers are also responsive to the odd harmonics of the RF signal, so you need to cut those off. And odd subharmonics, so the 1/3 frequency would also come through as well as the fundamental frequency. And then we use a double balanced quadrature sampling detector, which is also called a Taylor detector often, to generate the I and Q signals, and some low noise preamplifiers up there on the top right hand side, and finally the analog to digital converter to send it all into the CPU, which is shown there at the bottom right. The CPU handles everything else as well, like the USB virtual COM port and sound card, and everything else requiring the user interface. Now to the SSB generation itself. So SSB generation normally is done either using a superhet with a filter, crystal filter, to remove the unwanted sideband. So when you mix audio up to an intermediate frequency, you get a reduced carrier, and then you also get the upper sideband and the lower sideband together. And you use a crystal filter to filter out the unwanted sideband, leaving only the wanted sideband, and then you pass that through linear amplification to your antenna. In 1952, this guy Khan, he published a paper in the IEE journal, and his proposal was what became known as envelope elimination restoration, which was to split that SSB into amplitude and phase components. So that was the envelope elimination idea. You were getting rid of the amplitude envelope, and modulating it as amplitude separately. So he splits up an SSB signal into two separate paths. One is like a constant amplitude path, which is then modulated onto the transmitter signal as the phase modulation. And the other one is the amplitude envelope, which is then separately modulated onto the output signal. And magically, this results in cancelling the unwanted sideband. So it preserves the SSB nature of the signal. So, excuse me. Bit of water needed there. So the big advantage of this was that there was no need for a linear power amplifier. Linear power amplifiers are very difficult to do with high performance, and they're also very inefficient. So a class AB linear amplifier will generate just as many watts of heat as it does of RF. I believe the 50% mark is the theoretical maximum, and typical performance is even lower than that. So they generate a lot of heat, which you then have to extract using a heat sink and some fans, and pay a bigger electricity bill. And so for many reasons, linear power amplifiers are a problem. And the Kahn paper was all done using analog electronics, but nowadays we've got these very powerful digital signal processing, which really facilitates a lot of what we can do to implement this all digitally, and makes it much easier. So the two prior examples, the first time I came across this was the Polar Explorer, which was described in a QEX article in 2017, and this uses polar modulation or envelope elimination restoration in exactly the same way as Kahn's paper proposed, and resulted in at that time, 100-watt transmitter. In 2019, I saw this demonstrated at the Dayton Hamvention by Tony K1KP. He was the designer, and he actually had a table that was a few tables along from the QRP Labs table, so I had a good look at that then. And then a few years later, the Micro SDX by P1NNZ and the True SDX also implemented it with, of course, much lower cost hardware. So the way this works is you start with the microphone audio, which is just plain basic audio, and you use a Hilbert transform on that, which is the 90-degree shift to get I and Q signals. You then take the angle between the I and Q signals by doing the arctangent of the Q divided by I signal, and you get the magnitude of the signal by doing the square root of Q squared plus I squared. And then you've got in your hand then the angle and the amplitude, and you apply those separately to the transmitter signal, separate phase modulation and amplitude modulation. And the diagram shown there, a little bit small, that was extracted from the 1952 paper. I think another way of looking at this is we can consider conventionally X and Y dimensions, or horizontal and vertical dimensions, for explaining where we are or where the position of something is. So if you have a piece of paper in front of you, you can describe any point on that piece of paper as an X dimension, a number of centimeters from the bottom left corner, and a Y dimension, which is the number of centimeters in the vertical direction from the bottom left corner on the paper. But you could just as well describe this in polar coordinates as an angle from a point at the center and a distance from that point at the center. Now, I'm sure that many of you there have got a nice tower, perhaps, or with a rotator on it, or have seen such things. And this is very similar to the way we think of things in amateur radio, as a bearing from our antenna and a distance from our antenna. And so these two different ways of specifying a two-dimensional coordinate space are just as valid as each other and just as equivalent. They specify exactly the same point on that two-dimensional space, but one of them does it with linear x and y coordinates, and one of them does it with an angle and a magnitude. And I think that polar representation of SSB is, or any analog signal, is a similar thing. It can be represented either as an amplitude and a point in time, or as these polar coordinates, an angle and a magnitude. So I think that's one sort of analogy. Now, in the QMX, we had this amplitude modulation circuit already that was put there for CW envelope shaping and is now pushed into service for amplitude modulation for SSB. And this is controlled by the microcontroller DAC output, digital to analog converter output from the microcontroller. And so this, I knew at the time QMX was designed that it would have this modulator in place that would let me do the envelope shaping, but also would let me do the SSB modulation. So I had that very much in mind, and it was then a point of faith that I would manage to do it in giving people this information that QMX was going to do SSB in the future at the point that it was launched in May 2023. There was a difference in the way that this was done compared to microSDX. MicroSDX applied a pulse width modulation generated bias to the gates of the MOSFETs in the PA. The disadvantage of that, this is at the top right, is that the shape of the curve is quite non-linear, and it also gives a limited control range. So full power is obtained at about 1.25 volt DC, and it doesn't even go to zero when you apply DC bias of 0. And the reason for that is that even at DC bias of 0, if you're applying a 5 volt peak-to-peak square wave, you still have 2.5 volts peak hitting the gates, and that partially turns on the MOSFETs. Whereas in the QMX, I obtain quite an improved amount of linearity. I measured about 37 dB of dynamic range between the full amplitude signal, 5 watt signal, and when it's at 0. I still don't get all the way to 0. I have about 1 volt peak to peak left in the end because of leakage through the PA, but it gets a lot closer than on the microSDX. So again, these measurements I had made before launching the QMX, and it gave me confidence that eventually, with enough software, I would be able to implement SSB on the QMX. Now, for the phase modulation, this is done using a series of frequency commands to the synthesizer. So the QMX uses the MS5351M, which is a similar functionality to the Scilab's SI5351M, and it's capable of I2C bus communication speeds of up to at least 1 megahertz, which is the maximum I measured it. And at 1 megahertz, it's capable of 16,000 frequency updates per second with a really good accuracy. Now, frequency modulation of the MS5351M actually translates to phase modulation if you want it to. So the technique is to alter the carriance frequency by the correct frequency shift for a specific duration to give the required phase modulation shift. And the way I think of this is again, a sort of thought experiment. If you think of two frequencies, which are the bottom right there, I've shown in a red color and a black color. If you think of these two frequencies and you offset these frequencies by only 1 hertz, then you can see that if you start them off in phase at the bottom left of the graph, then 1 second later, they will end up in phase again at the far right of the graph. But in the case of the red signal, it will have had 1 cycle more than the black cycle. So if you had a frequency counter attached to them both, the red one would give 1 hertz higher reading than the black one. But the phase shift would have come all the way through 360 degrees. Now, if instead you said, okay, I want a 180 degree phase shift, you could say, I will stop that at half a second, and at half a second, which is the midpoint on that graph, I've got a 180 degree phase shift. You can see that the red and the black are exactly opposite each other. If you wanted 90 degree phase shift, you could stop at a quarter of a second and you would have a 90 degree phase shift at that point. And so by deciding the amount of time that you wait, or by deciding the amount of frequency shift, you can have any phase shift you want. So in the QMX, it's a matter of, we know the sampling rate that we're going to update the MS5351M at, say 16,000 samples per second. So we know the duration that we're going to apply this frequency shift for, and then we can use this very simple formula that I've shown there to calculate what amount of frequency shift is required to provide the desired phase shift. Now, this was the technique they used, Guido developed for the micro SDX, and it really, really works extremely well. So now come on to how we test SSB and the kind of result that we get. And the traditional method is a rather artificial signal consisting of a 700 Hertz tone and a 1900 Hertz tone. These are non-harmonically related. And these are generated and passed into the SSB modulator, and they result in an amplitude envelope, something like the one that you see on the left of the screen there. If you look at on a spectrum analyzer, you will see these two peaks in the middle of the spectrum analyzer corresponding to the 700 Hertz tone and the 1900 Hertz tone, but you'll also see a forest of other peaks which are getting less as you get further away, and these are the intermodulation products which are caused by the non-linearity of the SSB exciter. And so the idea is you want those intermodulation products to be as small as possible. One possible confusion point is that there are two different ways to specify it. One of these is in dB PEP, peak envelope power, which is the number of dB below what PEP would be, and that's the measure that I've shown there on the left. And the other is dBc, number of dB relative to one of the carrier tones. And so these have a 6 dB difference between them. You have to remember that when you see measurements, otherwise it can get very confusing. You need to be able to compare measurements like with like. VK2IHL had an interesting webpage where he had this table of what constitutes good and what constitutes excellent and poor IMD3. IMD3, if you want to look at just one single number, is on this previous chart. It's the first of these non-wanted peaks below the two wanted peaks. So the non-wanted peaks adjacent to the two big ones. And he, in his opinion, and I think this is backed up by other things I've seen around the internet, minus 40 dBc would be really excellent. Minus 30 is good, minus 20 is poor, minus 10 is very poor, and minus 5 is what he measured on the micro SDX. So he really didn't find that it had a very good result. I was therefore, of course, very nervous and about my claims that I would implement SSB and worried that I wouldn't be able to get a good enough performance. So when it came down to it, it was very easy to apply a single tone to the system and get a single peak on the correct frequency, and everything was great. But and I had the amplitude modulator working perfectly well as well. This is the amplitude shown on oscilloscope screen. The yellow signal at the bottom is the digital to analog converter output, and the blue signal is the RF output. So that looked very good. And however, when I tried to make it work with amplitude modulation, I could see these two peaks exactly as they should be, and the two little peaks near the bottom of the three in the middle are the intermodulation products. So that looked really, really good. But when I tried to do a single sideband, running it through my DSP, no matter anything I could do, I could not make it work out. I couldn't get the two peaks that I should have. So I spent at least, I think, 3 or 4 weeks last summer banging my head against this particular wall, and it really gets quite hard to keep coming and doing every day. Every day I would come up to the office and try and find a solution and go through the code again and again and again. What is my mistake? What have I done wrong? And then 5:30, the school bus would come home, the kids would come home, and we'd have dinner and put them to bed. And my mind is still thinking, what could I do? Maybe tomorrow will be the day. I'll have a bit more luck tomorrow. And tomorrow again, I'd be banging my head against the wall, and kids would come home from school at 5:30. Nope, still today wasn't the day. And that went on and on for weeks. And I developed all these additional things like dumping the arrays of data at various points in the DSP to a serial terminal output, so that on the USB virtual COM serial port, so that then I could log those in a serial terminal and plot them on a spreadsheet and try and figure out what was going on. And it was a really, really hard few weeks. But in the end, I started kind of doubting that anything even really did work, and was Guido making all this up? Was Khan making all this up in 1952? And was it really even possible? Until eventually I decided I would port Guido's exact SSB code from the micro SDX, which is open source, and a fragment of it is shown here. I would port that directly into my QMX code. And there were many disadvantages to it. So it was doing 16-bit integer arithmetic, not floating point as I had been doing. And it was running at a relatively slow speed of 4.8 kilosamples per second, and using approximations for all the mathematics like the arctangent, square root, and Hilbert transform, because these are very computationally intensive. But I was able to convert my floating point audio from the microphone or from the two-tone generator at the start into an integer and run it through his code. And suddenly, magically, I saw these two signals pop up at 600 hertz and 850 hertz, which corresponded to the two tones I was passing in. And I was just so overjoyed to see this picture on my scope, on my spectrum analyzer. If there's one picture which I have to say represents the joy and jubilation of the whole summer of 2024, it would be this picture. Because seeing those two peaks there after weeks and weeks of banging my head against the wall was a really amazing moment. Of course, all the other stuff to either side is really not what we want. If I compare that to how the two tones are supposed to look, if I go back here, where you see I was supposed to see these peaks nicely evenly distributed at nice even multiples of the tone spacing, 1200 hertz down and much lower, that was definitely not what I was seeing if you look at the picture here. But at least it was a start. And so from then onwards, I started going through and trying to replace each line by line, each line of code, and eventually found the problem was the arctangent function. So it's been too long since my school days. I'm sure it has for some of you too. But if you remember, perhaps if I jog your memory, the sine wave and cosine functions over a 0 to 360 degree input, they produce a single cycle of sine wave. The tangent function is different because it repeats itself twice in every 360 degree cycle. So the tangent function from 0 to 180 is exactly the same as from 180 to 360. And if you do a basic arctangent of the Q channel divided by I channel using the maths.h library function for arctangent, you get a result in the range minus 90 to plus 90 degrees, but you lose that information about where it should be, which of those two arctangent cycles in 360 degrees it should be. And so it's kind of like saying, if you've got your antenna and you want to point at a station at a bearing of 80 degrees, for example, it's kind of like saying, well, I don't really know if he's 80 degrees or 260 degrees in the other direction. I've lost that information. He could be in front of me or he could be exactly 180 degrees behind me. I've lost that information. And so because of that, I was failing to get SSB. And it was really that simple. It was a very, very simple explanation. And as soon as I went back to my code and I used a library function which is called ATAN2, which takes into account the quadrant, so which signals are positive and minus at the input, and it resolves that ambiguity and gives an output in the range minus 180 to plus 180 degrees. And so it completely resolves the problem. And as soon as I'd found that out, I started moving on to other problems and finding out how to optimize the other things in the system. So one of the problems I had here was the amplitude was showing these kind of overshoots on the rising edges, and I'm showing quite an extreme example here with stepped staircase waveform. But you get these amplitude overshoots and undershoots on the way down the waveform on the other side. And it also doesn't quite go to zero in the middle. So these were defects in my hardware, my amplitude modulator. But it's a good time to mention that one of my key principles in all of this development effort was that I would not make any changes to the hardware, because I'd already sold thousands and thousands of QMXs and QMX Pluses. I think by that time it was something like 9,000 of QMXs and QMX Pluses, and there was no way I could go and ask all of those people to start making hardware modifications to their radio, bearing in mind that a lot of the components are SMD, and most people don't have equipment for that. So the fundamental rule of the whole project was no hardware changes. Whatever I do, the software has to overcome whatever limitations I find in the hardware. So I had these quite significant challenges. And how I managed to solve that problem of the overshoots and undershoots was by doing a linear interpolation of the amplitude samples. So instead of applying amplitude samples 12,000 times a second to the digital to analog converter, I applied them 32 times more often, and a little bit linear straight line interpolation between them. And so what that did, it didn't really remove those overshoots and undershoots, but it made them 32 times smaller, so they were an awful lot less bothersome. Now, it also, of course, means a lot more calculation, and so you start balancing the calculation time, and even 168 megahertz CPU started to feel a bit slow at some points. The other trick I used was when I got to the low signal, when the signal was below about 1 volt peak to peak, I switched off, excuse me, I switched off the signal. You can see that there on the left oscilloscope trace, that as the amplitude got low, I switched off the signal completely, and that solved the problem where the amplitude doesn't reduce to zero. It doesn't really solve it, it just hides it a little bit and improves the performance slightly compared to not doing so. And so once I'd done all of this, I got these really very much improved spectrum analyzer traces, such as you see there, with a much lower amplitude intermodulation distortion products, and the two peaks in the middle really cleanly stand out. And so I was starting to see really, really good performance on the QMX transceiver, and way, way better than I had ever imagined would be possible. So I was foolishly launching QMX in May 2023, thinking that I would manage to do SSB, but I never imagined, I hoped I would be able to manage to do SSB, but I never imagined it would be as good as it actually turned out. And so then I started looking at even further ways to improve the performance, and all of this was since I last spoke to you in September last year, and really occupied the whole of my time ever since then. And so really the performance was very, very good, but I found that I was able to improve it even further by looking at phase and amplitude pre-distortion techniques. And this is very interesting. So it turns out that at low amplitudes, there is less phase delay between the power amplifier than there is at high amplitudes. And I believe one of the reasons for this is that the power amplifier has some parasitic capacitance, and like a varactor diode, when you put a higher voltage across it, that capacitance reduces, and then it causes less delay through the power amplifier. Now, in the 2017 QEX article I mentioned, they also found exactly the same problem occurred, and coincidentally, they also measured very close to about 55 or 56 degrees of phase distortion between zero amplitude and maximum amplitude. So it was really interesting when I started using an oscilloscope to make these measurements, which is on the top right-hand side of the page here. I actually got a very similar shaped curve to what they showed in the 2017 QEX article. So once you have this measurement of the phase shift versus the amplitude, in this case I've shown amplitude as the digital to analog converter number, you can then apply a phase shift in the opposite direction to cancel it out. And this is the whole principle of pre-distortion. Whether it's about amplitude or phase, the technique is to measure what the distortion is at the end and then apply a pre-distortion which will cancel it out to zero. Now the left-hand spectrum analyzer screenshot is without the phase pre-distortion. The right-hand screenshot is with the phase pre-distortion. And you can see that it really does reduce many of those intermodulation products quite significantly when it's switched on. On the amplitude side, I found that the amplitude was already so linear that I couldn't really make any measurements which would allow me to improve that. So the amplitude modulator is a really very linear device. So these pre-distortions was one technique which really improved the performance by quite a few dB. The final implementation, I'm using 12,000 samples per second for my processing, and I use 28 times amplitude interpolation. There were numeric reasons why 32 didn't work in the end, whereas 28 did. And that results in a sample rate of digital to analog samples to the amplitude modulator of 336,000 samples per second, which may sound like it's hard to keep up with, but in reality, when you implement this in the microcontroller, you use this DMA, direct memory access, which allows you to place a buffer of samples into memory and have the peripheral stream those out to the DAC pin at a defined rate with a timer, all without involvement of the CPU at all. And in the end, my measured, on 40 meters, my measured performance was about minus 35 dBc, which on the ARL method of dBPEP is minus 41. That's a really, really good result. And as I said, way better than I had ever hoped for. To give some comparison to some other transceivers, the KX2 and K3S measure a quite similar performance to what I measured on the QMX. So the KX2, they quote minus 36 dBc typical, and K3S, they quote minus 35 dBc typical. So again, the QMX had achieved a performance result that was equivalent to transceivers that add at least an extra zero or more to the price. And so again, a really positive result for QMX. Now I come on to a totally different topic, which was, once I had got the basic SSB working, there were many other things that needed to go in, or that I thought could go in. And one of these was controlled envelope single sideband. And controlled envelope single sideband, if you're not aware what this is a very, very interesting technique described by David Hirschberger in a QX article in 2014, which provides effectively more than double the effective transmitter power. It's implemented by 4 manufacturers only, which are the Elecraft K4, Flex Radio SDR, and Apache Anen SDR, and of course the QRP Labs QMX. And the way this works is that when you have a SSB signal, the actual SSB modulation process with the 90-degree Hilbert transform, and this applies whether it's done in any method, whether it's done using a conventional superhet method with the crystal filter, or whether you use analog phasing method, or whether you use a digital method as I do in QMX. In any of these methods, effectively the mathematics is the same. When you modulate from audio, even if your audio is perfectly limited and is not clipping, is not overshooting, your RF will overshoot. And this problem is because if you look at a simple square wave, for example, a square wave is made up of an infinite series of odd harmonics. And all of these odd harmonics, their zeros crossing all lines up. Now, if you do a 90-degree phase shift, unfortunately what happens is that all of their peaks line up instead of all of their zero crossings. So when you've done your 90-degree phase shift, you end up with a very, very spiky waveform where the spikes go up to kind of triple the amplitude of the fundamental. And this is the overshoot that we observe. Of course, a real audio signal is not as bad as a square wave. When we speak into a microphone, we don't get a square wave, but still we get a significant overshoot. And in the article, they quoted typically around about 60% overshoot for normal speech. And this is completely unavoidable. As I said, this is a result of the phase shift in superhet or analog phasing rig or a digital transceiver like QMX. However you do it, you get this unavoidable overshoot in the RF envelope. In any normal SSB transceiver, all the Yaesu, ICOM, Kenwood transceivers, all of them, they have to reduce the gain of the whole transmitter in order to prevent these overshoots from occurring. Because as soon as the RF amplifier is driven into clipping, driven beyond its 100% amplitude, you get splatter, which means you get a lot of distortion that results in signals in adjacent SSB channels. So your SSB is no longer limited to your 2.5 kilohertz or whatever it is. It splatters over into adjacent channels, interfering with other spectrum users. And so all transceivers have this automatic level control which reduces this gain to prevent that. ICOM, Yaesu, Kenwood, they put an awful lot of effort into improving their automatic level control with forward look ahead and making it fast and all kinds of tricks. But still, according to the article I mentioned, this Hirschberger article in 2014, you still get an overshoot, and typically the ALC provides about a 2 dB benefit in average speech power if it's a really, really good one, whereas the controlled envelope single sideband method produces about a 4 or 5 dB improvement in average SSB power. So what this means is when you have a 100 watt transceiver in front of you on the bench, conventionally, on normal speech, the actual average power of your speech will only be around 15 dB, 10 to 15 dB, the average power of your speech, because the peaks will hit 100 watts, but the average will only hit around 10 or 15 watts. Your peaks can't go over 100 watts because that will cause the clipping, which causes splatter. And so that has to be prevented. So your average SSB signal is only about 10 or 15 watts. But if you use CE-SSB, the average becomes twice that at least. And so a 100 watt transceiver with CE-SSB has about the equivalent power of a 200 to 250 watt conventional SSB transmitter. So CE-SSB was a really, really exciting thing to try to implement. Unfortunately, and this is a bit more on what I've just said, before and after oscilloscope screenshot with CE-SSB off and CE-SSB on. In this case, I had adjusted the gain such that there would be overshoot that was visible rather than causing clipping. And so that's what you see in the left-hand oscilloscope trace here. So it's about a 2.5 watt peak-to-peak amplitude signal. It's well below what the transmitter is capable of doing without clipping, so it allows us to see those overshoots. When CE-SSB is switched on, you see it very nicely controls those peaks. So I think another way of looking at it is a conventional transceiver will have to reduce the gain, and that will also reduce the weaker parts of the signal and therefore the average of the signal, whereas a controlled envelope single sideband transceiver handles the peaks and removes those peaks without reducing the weak parts. And you can see that here if I look with the mouse. If you can see that mouse there near the right-hand part of the trace, this little peak here in amplitude envelope on the controlled envelope sideband example is exactly the same as it is on the left-hand side. Whereas if this was a normal SSB transceiver, it would have reduced the whole gain to get those peaks inside the envelope, and that would have also reduced the weaker parts of the signal. Sorry, I've gone back instead of forward there. No, I've gone forward. So controlled envelope single sideband, it turned out that the description of it in the Hirschberger article was quite complex. I literally had printed that thing out and I read that about 100 times. The paper almost disintegrated. I read it so many times before I felt that I could understand enough to try and implement it. The disadvantage of the method is that it has quite computationally intensive filters involved. And in my case, because I have a 168 megahertz CPU, I don't have a desktop computer doing my calculations. So I was unable to find enough CPU time to be able to do the computation. I developed a completely new method of doing controlled envelope single sideband, which runs about 500 times faster than the method described in the Hirschberger article, and it has a slightly better performance. So even after Hirschberger's method, he still had about the 1% amplitude overshoot. I was able to get that to 0. And so it was a really, really nice result. Again, I spent at least 2 months working on this controlled envelope sideband, and you go down all these rabbit holes trying to find different solutions before you end up with the end result, which people in the end are actually using. But it was a really amazing result. And again, this shows the before and after where these amplitude envelopes are nicely controlled. These overshoots are removed without causing distortion. So this is a really important thing. It's not the same as compression. Compression audio causes distortion. If you have really heavy compression, you end up with a very unnatural sounding signal, whereas controlled envelope single sideband is about manipulating the RF envelope. It's not about compression. It's a slightly different concept. Now, on to the next piece. As I mentioned, phase distortion was something which I found a really big advantage. And the Polar Explorer in the QX article in 2017, which I saw at Dayton in 2019 face-to-face by the designer Tony K1KP, they use an AD8302 chip, which measures phase distortion and amplitude distortion. And this chip, even in a full reel of 2,000 pieces or whatever you got on an SMD reel, was still $19 per chip in quantity. That would be multiples of the most expensive other chip in the QMX, which is the LT6231 op amp. Those op amps, there are 2 in there, and they're $4 each in huge quantity. And so this would be completely impossible to include in the QMX. In any case, I already mentioned I have this rule, there will be no hardware changes whatsoever. On the other hand, measurement by hand was also quite difficult to do on an oscilloscope. I could just about manage it on the 40-meter band with the oscilloscope, but the higher up in frequency you get, the worse the display gets on the oscilloscope. And, you know, I have a 200 megahertz oscilloscope bandwidth. I don't have one of these $1 million gigahertz oscilloscopes. And so measurement by hand is difficult and also fruitless because there will be some device variation in the transistors from one QMX to another. I was, however, encouraged by the fact that the shape that I measured by hand, which is shown there on the graph on the bottom left, was very similar to the shape that the QEX article mentioned, which is shown there on the right-hand side. So that was very encouraging, at least. So I then started developing a method for the transceiver to self-calibrate its own phase error, to measure its own phase distortion. And the way I did this was to operate the receiver and the transmitter at the same time, but with the transmit-receive switched off. So it has a very simple transmit-receive switch, which is this circuit fragment shown there on the right-hand side, which just mutes the signal through into the receiver during transmit. But it turns out that it doesn't completely mute it, it just reduces it by about 30 or 40 dB, which is sufficient to not blow up the receiver, but it still produces a gigantic signal in the receiver, which is useful for being able to measure things. So what I did was I separated the transmit and the receive oscillator by a small frequency separation, something like 5 Hertz. It wasn't exactly 5 Hertz, but something like that. And then I can time the number of zero crossings by measuring them using by analyzing the waveform that comes through into the receiver digitally, because remember I've got everything digitally. I've got all these samples digitally, and I can measure those coming through and then I can count the number of zero crossings for a number of cycles. I can time with a very high degree of precision when those zero crossings arrive. And if I control and I measure the time at which I produce this 5 Hertz offset, and then I actually measure the real time that the reality of the zero crossings that are coming through the receiver, they will be offset by a certain phase shift, a phase delay, which is the phase error through the PA. So in other words, I know the signal I'm transmitting, and I know the offset that I should expect at the time I offset the receiver by 5 Hertz, and I count a number of crossings, and I calculate or measure the time that takes. But it will be a little bit delayed compared to the actual signal which I'm expecting, and that is the phase distortion. I can then ramp up the amplitude in steps, and I can measure that delay, and I can see how that changes at the different amplitudes, and store that as a correction vector in the memory of the QMX, so that for each band it then stores that correction vector and can apply it as pre-distortion during the transmission. And so I was amazed that this actually worked, that I could actually get the QMX to measure its own phase pre-distortion of its amplifier. But it actually works really well. The measurement by the automatic method is shown there on the right-hand side, the self-measurement, and the measurement using the oscilloscope is shown on the left-hand side. And you'll see that they're almost exactly the same shape, but of course the one on the right-hand side is a much smoother curve than the one I was able to measure by hand with the oscilloscope. You'll also notice that the phase angle of the two has an offset between them. So whereas the one at the top left starts at about plus 10 degrees, on the automated measurement it started at plus 35 degrees. This doesn't matter at all, because what we really need to know is the relative measurement, the relative phase distortion between the zero amplitude and full amplitude signal. It doesn't really matter that there's a phase offset, because it's a fixed phase offset. And what this phase offset is caused by is a fixed delay in the receiver system. So there'll be a delay through the bandpass filters, through the analog to digital converter, the preamplifier, everything. There'll be delay everywhere, but that will be fixed. And then we can separate from that fixed delay what is the variable delay that comes through the phase distortion of the power amplifier. So again, I was amazed that this worked, but it took weeks to make it work. More weeks of banging my head against the wall. Now, the next thing that I had to do was look at, unfortunately, some other tricks, because on some of the bands, the leakage through that transmit-receive switch is very high. So the transmit-receive switch has about 30 or 40 dB of attenuation. It's not the same on every band, and it depends on the bandpass filter adjustment and the power output. There are so many variables, but in some cases, the signal coming through to the receiver is so large that although it doesn't cause any damage to the receiver circuits, it does overload them so much that any kind of reasonable measurement is completely impossible. So I developed a number of tricks and to try to find a solution to this, and one of them was to run the receiver oscillator at 1/3 the actual frequency. And that is a kind of, I mentioned earlier to you that these switching mixers are sensitive to their subharmonics to a lesser degree, but because that passes through the bandpass filter, which is attenuating anything which is off frequency, that results in an attenuated signal at the actual operating frequency. So it lets us make the measurement with the same phase distortion delay, but with a much lower amplitude, so it doesn't overload the receiver. And the other trick I tried on some cases was to use a different bandpass filter to the one that was supposed to be used for that band, so that it would have a much higher attenuation in addition to the attenuation of the transmit-receive switch. So with the combination of these two techniques and an automated procedure which cycles through these various permutations, I was able to find ways to measure most of the bands in most cases. Now, the other big issue, which is often quoted with this type of system, polar modulation system or envelope elimination restoration system, is how to synchronize the amplitude and the phase modulation. And this is an absolutely critical piece of the jigsaw puzzle. there are delays all through the digital signal processing. There are delays through when you apply the amplitude modulation to when it actually happens on the power amplifier. There are delays everywhere. There are delays in the phase modulation because when you give a command to modulate the frequency, it takes a number of serial cycles to pass that into serial data and actually send it to the chip and act on it. There are delays that the chip has before it actually, from when it's received the command, implements the frequency shift. And there are also delays because when you command that frequency shift to implement the phase shift, the actual phase shift is only been attained at the next sample. One whole DSP calculation sample later is when even theoretically the phase shift has been implemented. And so there are all sorts of unknown delays, which I don't know. I don't think there's any possible way to predict what those are to any level of accuracy. And so you end up trying to make a calculation, which is very, very approximate because in reality it differs per band and per device. And so again, ideally, you want to measure and optimize this synchronization between amplitude and phase modulation. And so on the left-hand side of this graph, the left-hand spectrum analyzer screenshot, this is an example of when amplitude and phase are very poorly synchronized, and it results in a quite bad IMD performance. Whereas on the right-hand side, I'm showing an amplitude and phase modulation which are properly synchronized, and you can see that those unwanted products, that grass all the way on either side of the actual wanted two peaks, are very, very much lower than they are on the left-hand side. So it really illustrates how critical it is to get the correct synchronization between them. Once you've decided the correct synchronization delay, it is actually quite easy to implement it because you just have some buffer delay lines in the DSP code that delays either the amplitude or the phase by a fixed number of samples. And in my case, because I'm modulating the amplitude with 28 linearly interpolated subsamples in between at a much higher rate, I'm actually able to make my delay line in 1/28 of a DSP cycle. So it's a very accurate delay line, and that works very well. But the question still comes down to how do you calculate what that delay should be? The spectrum analyzer screenshot shown here is with a synchronization parameter of 51. What that means is 51/28 of a sample delay of the amplitude behind the phase modulation command to the 5351 synthesizer. So we know we need a whole sample, which would be 28 subsamples. We know we need a whole sample between the initial frequency command and when the phase shift will actually be achieved. But we also need this additional delay, which brings it up to 51 for all the other delays through the system. I have a little problem with my battery, and apparently my phone battery is almost empty, David.
Okay.
What I'm going to need to do is just wait one moment while I find my charger. It's amazing how much battery these videos use.
Yeah, they do use a lot more, don't they?
Well, I started off at about 75% battery, and it's gone down to now 5%. And we don't want to lose each other, do we?
No, I'm glad you spotted it, yeah, because of course we lose your audio as well as the picture. So, well, while his hand is doing that and just getting...
But it means, David, it means I have to go onto speakerphone with my headset. So let me just see if I can do that. And where is the...
While Hans is doing this, and I can see him in the corner of my monitor screen here. While he's doing that, just to remind you all, of course, we welcome your questions and your comments for Hans for the end of this talk about this or anything else that you've experienced with anything by QRP Labs. Are you hearing us okay now, Hans?
I'm hearing you, and are you hearing me okay?
Yeah,
Does it
it's
sound
fine,
all right?
actually. It's not too much different, surprisingly, so
Okay.
that's fine.
So I'm now sitting in front of it on speakerphone rather than with the headset in my ears and the microphone closer to me. So hopefully that's going to be okay.
Yeah.
I have to do that because I have to be able to plug the charger in. Otherwise, in a few
Yes.
percent, we would go down to zero, and that would be the end of us.
Yes.
So hopefully that will charge more quickly than it's using it on video, I hope. Otherwise, it still won't work. And my PC doesn't have any microphone or video camera. So we do have a laptop which we could use, I suppose, if it came to it. But hopefully it won't come to that.
Well,
Hopefully
keep an
this will
eye
be
on the if it starts going down the percentage, Hans, then let me know. We one thing we could possibly do is go to audio only, but let's hope that isn't necessary. Anyway, I should think.
Yeah, I think what I would do is take 5 minutes to boot up the laptop and log in on the laptop. That would probably be a good enough solution. But I think this will work, David. So I'll just keep an eye on it, and let's carry on regardless, and hope that we don't come to that.
Okay.
So yeah, what I was saying was, the optimum synchronization I found on 40 meter band, which is shown here, was a delay of 51 subsamples, and I wanted a way that I could actually measure that and optimize it by band, and also be able to optimize per device, because every device is likely to have slightly different characteristics in its PA transistors. And so I actually managed, I again was incredibly surprised that this was even possible, to again run the receiver and the transmitter at exactly the same time with the transmit receiver switched off. So there was tons and tons of attenuation. And then I offset the receiver by 2.7 kilohertz in one direction, so that instead of the receiver receiving those two transmitted tones, it's receiving this block 2.7 kilohertz further up. So I've shown that on this diagram inside the white square. And I chose 2.7 kilohertz because that lets me get the third, fifth, and seventh intermodulation products in the receiver passband. And you can then sum up the square of all the samples that you receive and square root them to get the average amplitude of those three intermodulation products. So basically the receiver is able, the system itself is able to measure its own intermodulation performance. I found that absolutely amazing that even worked. It does, and surprise, it actually works, and it generates the correct value, which is about as good as you can find by hand if you're modifying that synchronization by hand. And so incredibly it works, and it lets me generate then a procedure in the code for SSB calibration that measures this synchronization offset and the optimum value for each of the bands and on a per device basis. So just by summing up the audio that comes through in the normal SSB reception passband, when it's offset so as to receive the fifth, seventh, and third intermodulation products, and then accumulating for a second, so you get some nice averaging, you get a really nice value. And what this display shows you, I'm sure that some of you remember from last time or have one of these devices, and we have this terminal login. So you can connect a terminal emulator over the USB virtual COM serial port and access all kind of functionality in the terminal. And one of the things that what I'm showing here is this IMD synchronization tool, where, by the way, that also applies on the previous one. This, again, the bottom right image here is again showing the terminal interface, what that looks like. But you can also show the same thing on the LCD itself, albeit in a very much reduced format of a 20 by 16 pixel representation of the graph. So it doesn't look particularly good on the LCD screen as it does on a terminal on the PC. So you just install the terminal emulator. I use PuTTY, and it lets you see all of these kind of ASCII art graphs. And this is the IMD synchronization for the 10 meter band, upper sideband, and it shows it can really nicely measure for each of the bands what the optimum synchronization is. And it changes ever so slightly because there are some different delays through the filters, through the low pass filter, and through the PA itself. So the system basically measures from 15 to 75 in 28ths of a sample time, and then chooses the one that resulted in the lowest intermodulation product. And you can see up on the top right of the screen, these green numbers list what the optimum synchronization delay was found to be for each of the bands. And many of them are quite close to 50 or so, and all the way across the middle of the bands, they're all around 50 or so. It gets a little bit more at the 6 meter end and at the low end. But it was a really impressive result to be able to measure that. Moving on, another tools I put in this terminal login, and also again on the LCD, was just a simple test. The radio I had thoughtfully added in the hardware at the time a measurement of the amplitude at the amplitude modulator output. And so it's possible then to sweep up the digital analog converter and measure the PA voltage with the system itself and make sure that everything is working properly. So what we expect to see here is a straight line from 0 at the bottom left up until the maximum amplitude which is possible for the given supply voltage. And so it's just a nice test tool to make sure that if things are not working as they should, you get some idea of where the problem could be, some diagnostic information. The QMX has the capability to take the SSB audio either from the two-tone generator, which is built in, or from the microphone, or from the USB sound card. So taking it from the USB sound card, the built-in USB sound card inside QMX, is a very nice and powerful way of getting audio into the SSB modulator, and it's very useful for modes which are non-FSK modes. So there is an FSK mode. I always suggest that everybody should use the QMX in the Digi modes, and as I mentioned earlier, that does result in a really significant performance improvement for FSK modes. But there are other modes like VARA or WinLink which require SSB because they are non-pure FSK modes. This is a screenshot of me with my Raspberry Pi 400 sending and receiving emails over my closest WinLink server with an RF power of about 3 watts, and my closest WinLink server is in Bulgaria. It's 635 kilometers from my location. So WinLink is a very nice application that needs the USB sound card to be routed through to the SSB. So there's a configuration in the menu which allows you to select whether you want to use a two-tone test generator, which is built into the QMX, or its microphone, or the USB sound card. Another thing that gave me a lot of trouble and some more weeks of banging my head against the wall, which by now might be sounding familiar to you, was there was this horrible noise spuriae on the microphone inputs, and I believe this is due to limitations in the STM32's ADC. So the peripheral has an ADC inside the microcontroller chip. So for the RF sampling, where the performance is absolutely critical, I use a very high-resolution 24-bit ADC chip, as I mentioned, with 110 dB of dynamic range. But for what I assumed was less critical application, just receiving audio from the microphone, I assumed that I would be able to use the STM32 input itself. However, unfortunately, it's got these spurs every 500 hertz, which you see there, the blue spikes, which made it really sound horrible on the audio. You have this constant background going on in the audio. And so I had to spend weeks and weeks trying to solve that. And the end result they came up with was a noise cancellation against the internal microphone channel on the QMX. So I measure that, and then I subtract the internal one from the external microphone, and it cancels out those spurs to a very good, it provides about 25 dB of improvement on the worst of those spurs, which is such an improvement that the noise is completely eliminated from what you can hear. You can no longer identify that noise there by ear. So that was a very good result, but it took quite a lot of effort. The other thing I had to put in was voice operated transmitter VOX. So the normal way you would operate the transmitter is with a push to talk switch, and that can be on, there's a front panel input for the microphone and push to talk switch. But if you wanted to do it without the push to talk switch, there is a VOX option. So it's continuously, during receive, it's continuously monitoring the audio from the microphone, and you can configure a threshold at which it will activate the transmitter. Then there's an AGC function, which provides a relatively slow moving automatic gain control. So if you happen to move the microphone further or closer away from your mouth, then it will provide some degree of compensation for that. And again, that's very, very configurable. And then the other very interesting one, which again I spent quite a few weeks trying to make perfect, was the compression. As I mentioned, compression and controlled envelope sideband are not the same thing. Compression is done at the baseband audio and attempts to multiply the whole signal, or the weak parts of the signal, by more than the strong parts of the signal. And there are a lot of details in how that is done. And in the end, my solution was to try to control, to multiply everything by a defined gain, and then try to control and eliminate the overshoots of the amplitude envelope so that you don't get too much distortion from clipping. Compression does introduce distortion, but provided it's done to a sensible degree, it provides a very useful extra punch in the signal. Everything is totally configurable. Some might argue that it's over-configurable, and you can set the amount of compression from 0 to 99 dB in 1 dB increments. 99 dB would be completely ridiculous. Anything from 0 to 15 or so, I think, would be a normal sort of level. 10 dB, 15 dB is quite an acceptable compromise between extra punch from the compression and the unnatural sound of the voice. So a lot of features went into this SSB implementation, not just the SSB itself. There is also a microphone gain adjustment tool which can be run both on the LCD itself of the device or on the terminal. And what happens on the LCD, it scrolls across to the left. On the terminal, it scrolls up the screen and it shows you your microphone level. And I say to people, you should try to set the dB gain so that you're kind of making it into that kind of red area on speech peaks, but not maxing it out all the way on the right-hand side of the screen. It also gives you an indication when you're not speaking of what the sensitivity of the microphone is. And I should say QMX does require quite a high sensitivity microphone. Many microphones, many electret microphones these days have quite a low sensitivity because PC sound cards expect that, and they're designed primarily for PC sound cards. However, the QMX microphone does benefit from having quite a high sensitivity microphone because it's just feeding the ADC of the STM32 microcontroller directly. There isn't any preamplifier. Another thing which I added, which is what the DXs will tell you, is that if you want maximum punch on your DX, on your DXing or your contesting, you should amplify the treble parts of the speech and attenuate the bass part of the speech. And I provided in QMX a parametric equalizer, which allows you to set 3 different bands, basically a global gain, which affects everything, and a treble and bass gain, where you can configure the amount of gain in dB, as well as the frequency at which it is centered. And so it provides a completely configurable adjustment of bass, treble, and mid-band frequencies effectively. And there's a real-time plot which shows up both on the LCD if you choose to enter the menu in the LCD, or if you do it on the terminal, log in, you get this real-time plot on the right-hand side, which illustrates what the gain is versus the audio frequency on the horizontal axis. So that's a really nice feature. So there's a lot of sort of high-end features in the SSB implementation in QMX. It's not just a basic SSB transmitter. There's a lot of high-end features. So in summary, and this is a picture here of the SSB menu. It's got multiple different bandwidths. You can configure separately for receive and transmit between 2,500 hertz and 3,200 hertz. There's the transmit equalizer, the microphone AGC. You can specify a gain in dB for separately for sound coming through from the USB sound source. Microphone gain, compression. There's noise cancellation on the microphone, which basically means when the audio amplitude is below a certain level, it will cut it off completely. And there's the Vox. You can specify drive level, which is a percentage, a fraction of 1,000 as a percentage of the maximum available for the supply voltage. Controlled envelope single sideband is a really, really major thing. As I said, that's only available on the Flex radios and Aircraft K4 and Apache Anan, and it really provides a big performance benefit. And pre-distortion can all be controlled as well. You can also add a PTT to TX delay if you're using external linear amplifiers, for example. So now just finishing up, David, I don't know, I haven't got time anywhere around me, so I have no idea how long I've talked for, but I imagine it might be longer than I'm supposed to, so I apologize for that. But I'm wrapping up almost. So next things that I want to implement, some of this remains on my wish list from the start, was the left-right audio balance. This is a really easy one to implement, actually. So if people had a hearing imbalance, they'd be able to have a higher volume in one ear than the other. It would also be nice to have some kind of audio equalizer on the received audio. Binaural reception is when you get basically a tone-dependent left-right shift in the ears. And so I intentionally left the audio output of the QMX as two independent left and right channels. So at the moment, they're just being they're giving exactly the same information mono to your left and right ears, but the hardware allows a separate control of the audio level on the left and the right. And binaural reception is a way of sending the bass tones more to the left ear than the right ear, or the treble tones more to the right. And so it enables you to kind of become more spatially aware of the presentation of CW signals to your ears. There's also a possibility of having a dual watch receiver. That means the one ear would receive your main receiving frequency, but you would have a separate VFO on a different frequency up to 12 kilohertz away. So those are kind of future features which I want to develop. The QMX has got very high performance these days and very huge number of features, but as far as I'm concerned, in what I wish to develop for it, there's a long way to go before it becomes a mature product with finished firmware. So there's a lot of work still to be done. I also want to have RTTY to CW conversion as the Aircraft radios do. I really like that feature. And also PSK to 31 to CW is another possible operation. I want to implement all the functionality of the of the Ultimate 3S virtually inside the QMX. I want to have a basic scripting language so that people can customize QMX Plus and control some of the GPIO pins which are available on the board. Thinking also about logging tools, maybe perhaps have an optional micro SD card that could be attached and generate a log file would be nice. And perhaps a rudimentary pan adapter on the display using some of those customizable characters to show the band activity up and down from the operating frequency. And then I would like to develop hardware options such as the battery and internal ATU, which I showed earlier on in the presentation as a module to go in QMX Plus. I really like those options. I think they'd be very popular. So I'm working on a design for that. That will be future developments for QMX and QMX Plus. Now, another thing, by the way, this is the Polar Explorer prototype, which is the result of the 2017 QX article by Tony K1KP. And this is the Polar Explorer transmit only, he was demonstrating at the 2019 Dayton Hamvention. I forget now whether it was a 100 watt or 500 watt at that time, but in any event, what I did not know at that time was that, I assumed that Tony, I knew he wanted to find a commercial partner to develop the technology, the polar modulation technology, but I assumed that he had failed because it all went quiet and we didn't hear anything else. What I did not know until this May was that he had actually partnered with Flex. They immediately slapped him on a non-disclosure agreement, and he had partnered with Flex to develop this. And so in 2025 at Dayton Hamvention, Flex announced the Aurora transceiver, which is a 500 watt transceiver that uses polar modulation techniques, just like QMX does. And the benefits to this, they had a demonstration there, which I show at the bottom, which was a classic kind of joke, brick on key, a real brick they had and a real key. And this thing was producing 500 watts into this 50 ohm dummy load, which was basically like a radiator. You imagine like in old days when we didn't have such good central heating systems, some houses would have these kind of radiators, extra radiators installed, and it was like that kind of radiator. It was boiling hot, and they had this infrared camera that you could see the temperature of this boiling hot radiator, which was dissipating 500 watts of RF. And then you could put your hand on the Aurora and you could feel it was barely warm. It was almost as though it wasn't even switched on. And they said that they measure about an 85% efficiency of the transmitter. And so this was a very big thing. And they also included a mains power supply in the same cabinet. And the really big thing is the size. And then they have two versions, one which has a blank front and is controlled entirely by PC software, and the other one is a kind of standalone unit with the demodulation and everything built in, and a real user interface front panel, which you see there at the top. So these two versions of the radio, and the really big thing is that they've got a 500 watt transceiver in the same size and style enclosure exactly that Flex's previous 100 watt transceivers were in. And it weighs something like 8.5 kilos, including power supply and everything, for a 500 watt transceiver. So that was a really, really big announcement they made at Dayton in 2025. The price of this thing is not the same as a QMX. It's a very nice piece of equipment, but it's of course, and it's not really comparable because it's 500 watts, not 5 watts. But the price is quite eye-watering to me, at least. So it was very nice for me at Dayton to spend time with the Flex guys at their booth, and they were all very, very nice to me. They know that my radios cost $150, and you have to add at least another zero and then some before you get to the price of any of the Flex radios. So they don't see me at all as any kind of competitor, and it was just nice to have a really good technical discussion. Here I am with Tony K1KP, who is the designer of the Polar Explorer and the Aurora transceivers. And so that was really nice at Dayton this year. And then this chap on the right is Gerald Youngblood, who is the founder of Flex. And so he came with two of his engineers to have a look at the QMX. And I had a QMX on display with a laptop, so I started demonstrating the synchronization optimization. And it was really, really nice. Really made my visit this time at Dayton in the US this May, being able to discuss all of this with the Flex guys. And, I was surprised by their launch of the Aurora. I didn't know anything about it. So it was a very pleasant surprise and really made for a great event. So just to wrap up completely, I've been really surprised by the very high performance available from polar modulation, and I see a lot of potential for further improvement too. I could use a more powerful CPU and run the DSP processing faster, use higher number of taps in Hilbert transforms. I can at least go as fast as 16 kilosamples per second, update rate of frequency, maybe even higher, I don't know, but I tested it to 16. And so there's a lot of potential for future improvement. Huge thanks to Guido P1 NNZ, who really led the way with this. And, we say we stand on the shoulders of giants. I think this is a really good example of that, because Guido really showed that you don't need all of the expensive FPGAs and chips and things which they use in really advanced transceiver like the Flex transceiver. It can be done with much more humble hardware. So that was a really important contribution, and I'm endlessly grateful to Guido for showing us the way. For me, it's a really, really big thing. Some transistor curves are shown there on the right-hand side, and this is the key point. Transistors are non-linear devices. All of the characteristics of transistors are curves in the data sheet, and PA linear designers, linear amplifier designers, spend an awful lot of work trying to make those curves into straight lines, trying to linearize these curves, trying to make sure that they are always on as straight as part of the curves that they possibly can, so they get the best linearity they can. And still, it takes 50 engineers and all the expense and high-performance transistors, expensive transistors of an Elecroft K4, K3S, or Elecroft transceivers, and all of their expertise and RF engineers. And then some idiot comes along, which is me, and manages to get a similar performance from a handful of 5-cent transistors. And so it's a really, to me, polar modulation is a seriously impressive technique. And I believe we'll be seeing an awful lot more of it over the future years from other radio designers as well. So for me, it was a huge, long battle, 10 months. I really, looking back on it, have no idea how I got through it, but it was definitely worth it. And so just to summarize polar modulation, these three advantages, the higher efficiency is one of them. And there was a recent example a month or two ago, an article in Radcom about polar modulation that mentioned both the QRP Labs QMX and the Aurora from Flex, and put a lot of emphasis on efficiency. And it's certainly true, if you're running 100 watts or 500 watts, you're going to reduce your electricity bill quite considerably, or indeed your power demands if you're operating a portable station. But for me, the other benefits are just as significant, much lower cost, so you can use much cheaper transistors, smaller heat sinks because everything is more efficient. That leads to a smaller power supply, smaller enclosure. Smaller everything means everything gets cheaper, and that enables us to deliver more value to the customer, higher performance per price ratio, which is how I would say to define value to the customer. So it's a very, very important for that reason. And a higher performance for any given level of effort and expense, and indeed expertise, I would say. Previous to this, I have a 10-watt linear product in my product lineup, 10-watt linear kit, and that achieves about 10 decibels worse IMD3 than the QMX with its completely non-linear polar modulation method. So I can't overstate how important I think polar modulation is for our hobby, for our industry. And I believe that Flex have taken a gigantic step by adopting polar modulation. Is one thing somebody like me doing it, but for Flex as a big manufacturer, new technology is risk, and I applaud them for taking that risk and being far-sighted enough to see the value of that when they saw it at Dayton in 2019. So I have tremendous respect for what they've done. I believe we'll see much more of this in the future from other manufacturers. Just a summary of QMX, I converted the pricing, which is all in dollars, to pounds today. So you can see very low prices for a full-featured QRP transceiver multi-mode with all of these features. And finding QRP Labs, a bit more about QRP Labs. This is the web address of our shop. We have a forum. The number of members on the forum I should have updated today. This is from last year. It's actually closer to 10,000 now. So I think something like 9,500 instead of 8,500, which I mentioned last year. We also have a YouTube channel. So all of that's there. And I will send the presentation to David, as I did last year, in case there's anything you want to do about publication or sharing it with members. So that's about it, David. Thank you very much. And I, again, apologize. I'm sure I've gone well over time. I don't actually know what the time is, but from the hoarseness of my voice, I must have talked too much. Common failing, ask my wife. She's always saying the same thing, talks too much. So I don't know how much time we've got for any questions, or if there's anybody still awake out there, David. But that's the end. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Hans. She'll be sending you a message very shortly and saying, I need a kiss.
I think she's probably asleep. She's given up for tonight.
Because you're an hour late, so it's probably
We're 2 hours.
10...
We're 2 hours.
Oh, 2 hours. So blimey, it's 1:45 then, where you are in Turkey. Anyway, thank you so much for that, Hans. It's let's face it, it's a detailed and in-depth subject, but many people enjoying it. And if you have a particular question or an observation or a comment or anything to make to Hans, this is the time to do it now. And we've got a couple of comments here from lots of people, by the way, say thank you very much. Donard M0KRK, can I check, is SSB already in the QMX that we purchased some time ago, or does it require a firmware upgrade? I think I know the answer to that, but please answer it.
Well, it was April this year that I released the official production firmware. There was a period of about 6 weeks of beta testing where I released a beta test firmware for people to play with. It's actually the only time I've done a beta test firmware like that, but it was, I think, such a significant development that it required that. But yes, since April, so if you bought your QMX since April this year, it would have the SSB firmware on it.
Wonderful. Okay, so if not, it's easy to find it. Just for Donald, he may have been, by the way, one of those. If you remember, we did have a little bit of a bulk purchase from you here at this club. So I can't remember if Donald was one of those. So how would they go about upgrading the firmware?
The firmware update procedure on a QMX is extremely easy. And you simply download the zip file from the QMX page on the QRP Labs website, unzip the file. You put the QMX itself into the firmware update mode via one of the menu entries, the easiest way to do it. There are several ways to do it, but just from one of the menu entries is the easiest way. And when it's in firmware update mode, it will appear on your PC as a USB flash drive, pretends to be a USB flash drive, and then you simply copy in the new firmware file that you've downloaded from the website, and it will install it itself, and there's no more to it than that. That's it. So it's really easy.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for clarifying that, Hans. Rick M7 GMT says, a fantastic talk, exclamation mark. The self-calibration and pre-distortion is absolutely absolutely epic. Top marks on breaking through the wall with your head. Yeah, I see. I can see what he means. I mean, 10 months is a long time. And I remember you did talk about this openly when we met a year ago, roughly, for that talk. And you had kind of promised it, maybe with a small p, but as an option. I mean, if it obviously took you a lot longer than you thought, was there a stage really, at any stage, where you really thought, I'm not going to be able to do this and I'm going to let people down?
There was such a stage, and that was before, I think before September. I had pretty much cracked it by the time I spoke to you in September last year. I had cracked the basic SSB generation, but there was a stage where I just couldn't get my two tones coming out, my two test tones coming out. And, I started even thinking I'm going to have to tell people, sorry, I can't manage this. And there are going to be a bunch of unhappy people. I started thinking through my obituary, what it would sound like. It was a good guy. He tried. But he was a little bit overambitious, maybe. Bit off more than he can chew, and he couldn't manage to do SSB in the end, but he tried. I was thinking through like that obituary, but in the end, it was that breakthrough of compiling in Guido's code, and although the result, he had used an awful lot of approximations because of the much lower power CPU, the result wasn't great. At least the two tones showed up. So my period of doubt at that point was ended. But certainly, yes, before that, I was very much thinking, am I going to manage this? am I going to have to remind people that it was only a promise with a small p, not a capital P, and hope that people forgive me, or what will happen? So, but once I was done with that, I was pretty much, I think, much more having a lot of fun with some of these things. Although I talk about banging my head on the wall over each of these projects for about 2 or 3 weeks, it was in many cases very exciting work. I mean, controlled envelope single sideband is a really major thing, and there are no transceivers in this size category or price category which manage this. Aircraft customers have been asking for it on the KX2 and KX3 for years, and it's not there, and probably never will be there. And so it's a really major big thing, and I was really on a high, really, with some of these successes as I developed them. The compression, the the parametric equalizer, and especially, as you said, this ability to calibrate, to self-calibrate. Had I not had that, the performance would still have been very, very good, and I would still have been able to generate a one-off value. It wouldn't have been customizable per unit automatically, but it still would have produced quite acceptable performance. But being able to make a way to measure its own phase distortion and optimal synchronization, it was totally epic, and I was really surprised that it was even possible. And so 10 months was a very, very long time, and there were some periods where I was in severe doubt, but for much of that time I was in great excitement as well as all the hard work. So in the end, it was worth it.
Yes, it is, and as you say, the technology in that, and it's not just being able to make the products ultimately cheaper and smaller and lighter and everything, but of course we are living in a world where now we're ever more increasingly aware of how things need to be more efficient, because of the pressures on energy and things like that. So I'm sure this has probably other ramifications in other industries, even completely different, separate from radio, doesn't it?
Well, I think it's not new in many industries. Have been using similar techniques for a while. If you are Norfolk FM radio station, if there is such a thing, I don't know, but if you're Norfolk FM and you have a 50 kilowatt radio station, you would like that to be as efficient as possible, because your electricity bill is gigantic, your maintenance bill will be gigantic, you'll have to do cooling. So if you can have a 50 kilowatt radio station which is 90% efficient, then you'll only be wasting about 5.5 watts as heat. Whereas if it was only 50% efficient, you'd have a 50 kilowatt waste of heat. There will be a major difference in your electric bill and your cooling bill, your maintenance bill. The size and the expense of the equipment is huge.
Yeah.
The other place which already, there are a lot of battery-powered applications where, and QMX being portable is also another one of them. You want your battery power to go as far as it possibly can. So efficiency is an important parameter. And mobile phones is very important, and parameters, battery life is a very important parameter. And so this kind of technique is already in use in commercial applications like mobile phones, and at the other end of the spectrum, extremely high power TV and radio stations already using these types of techniques. But I feel that radio amateur manufacturers are a little bit conservative, and the progress is very slow. At some point, amateur radio was pioneering, but I worry that some of that pioneering spirit has been lost, and that in some areas the manufacturers have become quite conservative. And this is, I think, one area, because this could have been done quite a bit earlier than it was done. And, Flex are really the first major manufacturer to do this in a sort of high-power desktop standard transceiver, the Aurora. But it could have been done. The technology would have allowed that to be done quite a few years, or a decade or more, earlier than it has been. And so I hope this kind of will lead to some innovation across the industry. And I think, it's been quite conservative until now in many ways.
That's a good thing to think about. As we are wrapping, getting close really where we need to wrap the programme. But I must read some of these other comments for you. Graham G8NWC says, what a great insight to all. So looking forward to the winter build project of my QMX Plus and the audio enhancement coming up for us. That struggle with hearing and imbalance on ears. Thank you, and see you at the convention, he says. Yes, because of course you are going to be at the convention. I mentioned the RSGB convention a little while ago, and just over 10 days or so, you're going to be there, and you're giving a talk there. What does that talk on?
I'm giving a talk about polar modulation.
Are you? Right.
I probably will recycle some of the slides I've used tonight. And by the way, Flex are also going to be there. Mike Walker from Flex will be at the RSGB convention. He'll be talking about Aurora. And so it'll be nice to catch up with him again. I saw him in Friedrichshafen too. And so, yes, I will be at the RSGB convention.
I think we had a talk, I'm sure, from Mike Walker some years ago. Because I remember, no disrespect to you or any other speaker who's ever been on NARC Live, but I remember his background in particular. He lives on the edge of a lake. Do you remember that? And it was an incredible... So I thought it was one of those backdrops, an artificial background, but it wasn't. That was where he lived. Real. Pardon?
Wow, that was real.
That was real, and it was. I just remember that very stand out from that. Back to.
And then I'm also. They also invited me this year to be the banquet, the after dinner banquet.
Oh, at the convention, yeah. Oh, good.
So I'll be speaking after dinner as well. They asked me to talk on some of the more sort of human aspects of how painful it was to get through the process of such a long development, and. I've got 10 minutes, so I don't know how I'll keep myself to 10 minutes, but I'll try.
Well, it will be fascinating. I mean, you talk about the human side. You are running, it's a relatively small company compared to all of the other companies you've mentioned, Flex and people like that. But you're very, very open, and I've said this to you before, incredibly open, really. And you mentioned earlier on that one of the other rivals or one of the other transceivers, has a lot of Chinese competition. Are you worried at any point that someone in China is just going to reproduce one of your kits and manufacture, literally make it look the same and be a fraction of the price? Although I know it's already well priced, your products.
I think this is a question I do get asked quite a lot, and I think that being well priced is one of the things that avoids that, because there isn't an awful lot of money they could make in it. But the other thing is that the micro SDX, which I mentioned, which had been produced a lot in China, and another example of that kind of thing was the MCHF. And the MCHF was produced in China. I think the Chinese version was called RS918, and it was even stocked at some UK distributors, which upset Chris, the designer, quite significantly. And so that was another example where that happened. But in both of these examples, they were actually open source projects. And so the source code was freely available for anybody to copy. And I believe in micro SDX case, they didn't have any kind of licenses. So they were really not even legally entitled to anything. Whereas in the MCHF case, he did have licenses, which were then breached by the people copying it. But, imagine trying to enforce something on the opposite side of the world when at the end of the day, you're only a small business. If you were Samsung or Apple, you can fight these things out in court with massive armies of lawyers. But at our kind of scale, there's nothing that you can really do about it. So it is a worry.
I mean, can I just ask you, coincidentally, one of the questions that's just been put up by Brian M7SEY is, have you got a patent yet? But I guess it's not all your own technology.
Well, I don't think you could. You couldn't have a patent on the polar modulation, because that's something that's been public domain for decades. My method of controlled envelope single sideband is a new thing which I developed, but patenting is an incredibly expensive process in three different ways. Firstly, to apply for a global patent costs something like $25,000 if you want it to cover Europe, Asia, and America, which you would need to do. Secondly, you then spend the next 20 years trying to negotiate licenses with different competitors to try to get money out of them so that you can make back your $25,000. And that's also a very expensive process, incurring more costs to draw up contracts and negotiations and time and so on. And thirdly, your patent is worth only as much as you can spend on lawyers to defend it, to make sure that people don't violate it. And that is a very difficult topic to do, particularly when we're talking globally. Yes. Trying to enforce something in China, for example, would be a tremendously difficult enterprise to try and do. So I think that for pharmaceuticals, if you're developing the cure for cancer or whatever you're doing, then that's a tremendously massive market, which covers the entirety of humanity. But for smaller businesses, and ham radio is a very small world, basically. I think that patenting is probably not an economically viable thing for somebody like me to do.
No.
I think if you're in a big company like Yaesu or Kenwood or something, maybe they have enough sort of machinery behind them to be able to do that. But I mean, cloning and copying is a risk. And to finish the previous answer, and I get around that by encrypting the firmware. So the QMX firmware is encrypted using 256-bit encryption, which is an extremely high level of encryption. So the QMX firmware can only be used on QMX hardware. So when we program the chip, we lock the chip. And after that, the bootloader has its own decryption, and it can't be read by anybody, not even ST can. If you return the chip to ST, there's nothing they can do to extract the contents. So we use a really, really powerful level of encryption. The QMX firmware file could not be installed on any blank vanilla STM32 chip. Neither could the QMX firmware be used on any other radio, and neither could the QMX hardware itself run any other firmware than QMX firmware that was official from me. And so I've protected myself by that method. There was an example many years ago where the QCX Mini was actually copied in China. And it was actually found by my contract manufacturer in China. He found this was being sold domestically on an internal China-only domestic platform. I contacted the designer, who was an amateur radio operator of that, and he had, but the QCX was a very different situation because the firmware was really quite lightly protected. It was nowhere near as heavy protection as the QMX with its 256-bit encryption. Because it was a much simpler, older CPU, I didn't have the capability to protect it in that way, whereas on QMX I do. And so he had actually copied it. And when I contacted him by email, he was responsive, and he said, well, I did this because it's hard for us in China to import anything from abroad. We have to pay taxes. I said, the whole world has to pay taxes when they import anything from abroad. And your taxes in China are 13%, 13. In England, you have 20% VAT. Yeah. Here we have 20%. They have less taxes than the rest of us. We all have to pay taxes. So I said, it's not really acceptable to do what you've done. And he agreed, and he took it down. He was apologetic, and that was fine. So we got around that by discussion.
Yes.
But, people assume that cloning is the biggest problem that people can have. The schematics for the QMX and all of my products, the schematics are open. The hardware description is open. We spent a lot of time discussing it. The hardware is all open. But the 95% of the work is in that software. Most of those 10 months, I was banging my head against software, not hardware. And so protecting the software is, I think, enough.
Yeah.
In any case, I don't feel that that's the biggest risk that there is to my business. The biggest risk to my business is in global regulations and taxation. You look at what's happening in America. 60% of my market is America. Mm-hmm. And that is being hit now because they're imposing tariffs on everything, yes. Which, the rest of us had for years. We have in the UK for years, in Europe. We have import VAT for years, forever, I think. So it's nothing new for us, but because it's a new thing for the Americans, it's a big risk. And there are other risks, such as what would happen if Europe decided to properly implement its regulations on waste disposal or on CE And if everything had to be CE approved or waste
And
regulations and all
independently
of that
tested.
stuff, if
Yes.
all of that came through,
Yes. Yeah.
my prices would double.
Yeah.
Or I would have to employ a whole army of administration people to manage all of that stuff. And so that's, to me, a far bigger risk than the risk of being copied or cloned. Sorry, it's a long answer.
No, it's good. And I could talk for hours with you anyway. And this is something that I was often asked over my 40 years of designing and selling products, and it always worried me. And I was often asked by people if we came up with something fairly innovative and just said, have you patented it? And you just have to say no for lots of reasons. And the ones you've said, for sure, getting the price right as well. So trying to, make sure that, well, why would someone copy this if they can't make much more money from it? And also the fact that even if you did manage to patent it, the time it would take to actually fight it, even if you had the money and unlimited funds to fight it, meantime, the damage is being done by somebody selling a copy for years, maybe, because it can take that long. But
it just doesn't make sense in our industry.
No, it doesn't. No.
But I did have discussions with a lot of different people about this, because a friend of mine, Martin Jew, who founded MFJ and ran MFJ for 52 years, they have a lot of patents on stuff. I also work with StepAR. I'm not sure if you knew that I produce now the StepAR controller.
I didn't know that. I heard that they were stopping getting out of the amateur market, but okay.
Yes, they have done. Yeah. Right. But their controller front panel assembly is also now produced by me, and I did a redesign of it to update it. And so they hold a number of patents on various things as well. And they all, both Martin and John, who runs StepAR, told me that it's not really giving you the protection you think it will, and the people it's making the money for are the lawyers. That's it. Yeah, it's not really helping you.
It would take years, I think, to fight.
And even you can do it yourself as well. You can make patents much cheaper by writing your own patent. But you still have to. There's still a lot of expenses at some stage in the process.
As you say, a good route defense is just to make the products good value and well available and well engineered and everything, get a reputation, and I think people would then rather buy from the source. We really must
just keep moving forward.
Yes.
And don't. If I stopped to waste time on patents, I would stop moving forward.
Yes,
the cost would be much worse. Right?
Absolutely. I must read a few more comments, and then we must finish tonight. And it's also Thursday for you now, isn't it, over there? Jim G0UPL, a magnificent way to spend an evening, Hans. Awesome presentation in engineering. Some of these I haven't read yet. Malcolm G3PDH, excellent talk and amazing technology. The changes in technology for radio seems endless. And Roger G3LDI, a great competition for flex, Hans. Makes me also realise how much technical info I have forgotten. I think it's also moved on quite a lot, Roger, as well. I'll tell you that I've got a page of things that I was going to ask you, but I think we really need to finish there. I love talking to you, and I hope everybody also enjoys listening to you. I'm sure they do. You're so open, as I said, about both about your products and justly proud, but also open about the challenges as well of doing it. I want to leave you with some, maybe you've been told it before, but maybe not. Over my years of making things, I did have a few failures and problems, and someone once put their hand on my shoulder, in our contract manufacturer actually in Cambridge, and he did say to me once, if you don't fail now and again, you're not trying hard enough. And, yes. And I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Yeah,
I'm not wishing you to fail for anything, but it did mean a lot, and I've always remembered it, 20 years on from when he told me. I remember having 200 or 300 products that were literally being packed in their cases on a carrier, and someone found a problem with them as they were doing it, and it was a big, big blow to me. And I just remember this person telling me this, so I hope that might help you with something.
Yeah, there have been lots of mistakes over the years, and some of them have even been expensive mistakes. It happens, but yeah, if you don't make mistakes, you're not trying. I have heard that before, and I agree completely.
Yeah.
And the other thing I think that's worth remembering is, I tell myself all the time as well, when things get hard, is nothing that's really worth doing is going to be easy. If it was easy, everyone would have done it already.
Absolutely.
And then there wouldn't be as much point in doing it. And so you have to accept that things are difficult for a reason, and they're difficult because they're worth doing. and that keeps me going.
Yeah, absolutely.
It stops me from giving up. That and a healthy dose of being too dumb to know when to quit, David, I think is a very important attribute.
It is. Otherwise, nothing would really worth doing would ever happen again. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Hans, and I look forward to seeing you in person and everybody else going to the convention in a couple of weeks' time. But we must let you get to bed now because it's well into Thursday for you.
And don't worry, I'm the boss. I can sleep all day at home.
Thank you once again.
Thank you. Take care. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. There we are. Hans Summers from QRP Labs. I literally could talk to him all evening. It's wonderful. Thank you again for him, and thanks to everybody for watching this evening. Just to remind you what's happening in the club this week. On Sunday we've got the GB2RS News on GB3MB at 7 p.m. We've also got something I didn't mention on Monday night. It's the RSGB's monthly Tonight at 8 programme, and on Monday evening, which we host here, and it's on V73WW 100,000 QSOs from the Pacific Ocean with Jamie Williams M0 SDV. You can just Google Tonight at 8 from the RSGB and you'll find out many details of how to watch that. And then next Wednesday, October the 8th, we've got that tabletop sale between 7:15 and 9:30 in the dining room hall at the CNS school where we usually meet. But that's it for tonight. Thank you very much for staying with us, and we look forward to seeing you again here on NARC Live in 2 weeks' time. But until then, from Tammy M0TC,
bye-bye,
and from me, David G0UPL, take care of yourselves, look after each other. Bye-bye.